morning. Convening the committee on House Investigative Committee to investigate compliance with audit numbers 19-12 and 21-01. Happy New Year to the members of this committee and to those subpoenaed witnesses joining us on the Zoom call, as well as to the public. Today is January 10th, 2022. This is a hearing of the committee scheduled for 9:30 a.m. in person and via video conference room 325 here at the State Capitol. Members, as you can see from the notice, there has been an amendment to this notice of meeting, which had initially come out on January 3rd, and we now are going into a hearing process. This has been prompted because information came to the committee on Friday that has prompted us to bring back Mr. Ross Murakami of KMH LLP for his continued testimony. So we issued this amended notice of hearing as soon as we could. We followed it up. I followed it up with letters to all of the subpoenaed witnesses, inviting them to submit proposed written questions at 9:30 a.m. at the beginning of this hearing. So that would give them the full more than 48 hours to prepare any questions. It unfortunately didn't give us, it will not have given us any time to prepare and look at those questions. I will note that no questions had previously come in from any of the subpoenaed witnesses when Mr. Murakami was first before this committee on December 15. So my staff will be monitoring if any questions come in, and for any of them, for any subpoena witnesses who may be listening via YouTube, you can still submit them. Please get them in as quickly as possible, and they will be shared with the committee members as soon as those questions are provided, or soon thereafter. The process for this, members, will be that Mr. Murakami will be represented with counsel, and he will be coming in at 10:30 a.m. So we will return to the bulk of our agenda, which really was the discussion of the draft report, which was submitted to you as committee members, as well as all of the subpoenaed witnesses on December 30th. There is a window of time in which all of the subpoenaed witnesses can submit any written comments or responses by this Friday. And I have given them, I believe, until the morning time. I want to say 9:00 a.m., but that will then give us time and our staff members, I will check that time, members, but that will give us, as well as our HMSO staff, who I have to comment and say have been really wonderful in going through thousands and thousands of papers of documents, as well as hearing testimony and analysis in order to prepare the draft report, as well as the comments that were submitted by members of this committee. So provision of those written those written comments will be provided to our committee. We will forward them to all of you, and then our staff will be working very hard over the Martin Luther King Jr. weekend so that we will be prepared to vote on Tuesday, when we will have the last and hopefully final meeting of this committee. Any questions, members, on so far this kind of overall process that we are approaching? Seeing none, members, I apologize. Let me make sure that all of you are recognized as being here in the committee room. If, this is, I think, well, with the exception of a House Minority Leader, I think this is the first time that there has been this many committee members in the committee hearing process. So I'm gonna turn first to my right, and if you could introduce yourself, as well as your role both on this committee, as well as any subject matter you might have. So I'm gonna turn first to Vice Chair.
Linda Ichiyama, representative for House District 32 and Vice Chair of this committee.
Mark Hashem, representative from East Honolulu. I'm the Chair of Agriculture and I oversee ADC.
My name is David Tarnas, State Representative from House District 7 on Hawaii Island, and I chair the Water and Land Committee. And so I'm particularly interested in the matters regarding Department of Land and Natural Resources.
Morning, Kyle Yamashita from Upcountry Maui. On the Finance Committee, I oversee the capital improvement budget.
And Representative Yamashita and myself serve on the Legislative Management Committee. I will introduce Representative Val Okimoto, who is the House Minority Leader. Hopefully she will be joining us shortly. And then I'll go to Chair Kobayashi. Go ahead.
Dale Kobayashi. I represent Manoa, Makiki, Macaulay area. I'm the chair of the Legislative Management Committee.
Aloha, Amy Perruso. I am the representative for Wahiawa, Whitmore Village, and Launani Valley, and I serve as vice chair for the Agriculture Committee.
Thank you, members. Okay, so I wish we could do this all in person and have this open to the public as we had hoped that we would be opening the Capitol, but because of the Omicron virus, the Capitol remains closed to the public, but we can continue to conduct our meetings here with the proper protocols, as you can see. So members, the amended notice of hearing does have discussion of draft report, continued testimony of Mr. Ross Murakami, issuance of subpoena ducis tecums to ADC and KMH, continued discussion of draft report and additional committee procedural matters. I will take one more thing out of order just because, as I said, we may lose some committee members. I'd like to take up first the issuance of the subpoena ducis tecums to ADC and KMH LLP. Because of events that have happened and additional testimony and evidence that we have received as of Friday, members, this is unusual, but I have already spoken with representatives from both ADC and Mr. Ross Murakami and KMH LLP. So we've already begun to work out the language of the subpoena ducis tecums. And as part of my vote and request for this committee, if you would provide the discretion that when we finalize these subpoena ducis tecums, that I would have the discretion to continue to work with the representatives of both of those agencies to be able to further refine the language so that we can get the tailored documents that we were requesting. So does anyone have any questions about that use of discretion? Go ahead, Representative Kobayashi.
Thank you, Representative. So as you mentioned, time is extremely short. We've already been provided with a really incomplete draft report that you had written, and people have been asked to comment on it. And now, as a result of recent developments, which has not been made clear to me in particular, it's decided to continue to subpoena witness and documents. In terms of the short time frame we have and the fact that we've already come out with at least a partial draft report, I assume that anybody that's going to be subpoenaed here, what they have to say could potentially be included in the report, which is why we're the only reason we do it. So are we going to be able to have meaningful report back and forth in the committee and with other interested parties, given the short time frame and the fact that we're still doing what appears to be fact-finding at this late stage?
Thank you, Mr. Kobayashi, Chair Kobayashi, for your question. I am confident that we will be able to complete our work. I understand that there is one interested party who believes that this is an incomplete report. I also know and trust that this committee has been hard at work for the last several months, and that the back and forth amongst committee members, which has been provided to all committee members, has been available. So there has been much discussion, much conversation in this committee that I'm confident that we'll have a meaningful report. Now, with respect to the additional information that will be provided, unfortunately, due to some of the conduct of interested parties in this matter, it has prompted this unusual step. And I have worked diligently with both KMH and ADC to target the necessary documents that will need to be produced, and so that we will not be getting thousands of pages of documents that we are going to be requesting. So I believe and I trust in the work and the abilities of both members of this committee and staff that we will be able to produce a meaningful report. On the fact of incompleteness, again, there is, this is a House Investigative Chapter 21 committee process, and we are following our rules. So we have provided the proper amount of time as well as a draft report. We are going to discuss, I believe, the most incomplete portion of the report, but through the comments and discussion of this committee, I think we will be able to get good information to be able to complete a meaningful report. So that's my response. Chair Kobayashi, any questions?
Yeah, I do. So is it possible to understand, because it sounds so cryptic, I mean, that an interested party inserted themselves, said something. I mean, can you just explain to me in particular what exactly you're talking about that
Yes,
occurred?
when we bring forward Mr. Murakami, we will go into that. And as we talk about the subpoena ducis tecum, you will see that there was, it was in fact the letters Mr. Murakami sent to the committee on December 17th and December 27th that your office and all of the offices of our committee received. So it's all related to information that has been provided to this committee and all committee members.
So that's the letters about correcting the completion of the audit date that
Changing and
clarified.
correcting, then that's what we're going to try to unravel. Mr.
Okay,
Kobayashi.
so you know, for when I look at the what was sent as draft report, maybe I got something different, but the copy that I have, there's several sections that say things like insert discussion of this there. So which to me, if you're complete, you don't have those kind of situations where you say insert this. I mean, I should actually be able to see the entire verbiage of the report to comment on it rather than kind of a TBA type of, you know, to be inserted type of thing.
Thank you for your comments. Representative Kobayashi, can we return to the question of the subpoena ducis tecum? Because we will, in fact, take up your comments about those sections, actually in very specific detail as we move forward.
Okay, so regarding the subpoena, if I could have one more.
Yes.
That,
Is this a question about the subpoena?
Yes.
Okay, go ahead.
So that, you know, we subpoenaed what, tens of thousands of documents to this point. And presumably it required serious work and hours of review by finance committee staff and people on this committee. And when you look at what's in the report to this point, I don't really see where anything that was in those subpoena documents has really come to anything in the report. So quite a bit of work and quite a bit of documentation for something that really didn't result in anything meaningful in the report for those subpoena documents. So you know, my comment would just be, you know, why are we subpoenaing more documents at this point? And I think maybe if I understood exactly what the situation is, maybe it wouldn't be so curious to me, but at this point, it is very confusing why we'd still be doing this.
Okay, and we'll get to that soon. I do want to comment, Representative Kobayashi. Each comment in the draft report is backed up by the testimony collected and received by this committee.
Right.
We don't necessarily have all the footnotes to that, but you can rest assured that this is grounded in the documentary testimony as well as the testimony and oral testimony that has been provided to this committee. We will be working on that, but again, as I said, we are under a very hard timeline. And so that will all come out in the final report. But you can rest assured that this is all grounded in the documents and evidentiary testimony that has been received by this committee.
Yeah, I was one of those questioning at all. I'm just saying, as far as the documents subpoenaed,
There
it
are
seemed like
certainly
kind of a large ask for something that had very little impact.
Oh, no. Let me rest assured. Let me reassure you, Mr. Kobayashi. Well, we went over all of these documents. And in fact, some of these documents we'll be likely discussing as well. All right.
Thank you.
Okay, so let's move to the issuance of the subpoenas ducis tecum. Members, for the first subpoena ducis tecum, I'm requesting and recommending that this committee issue a subpoena ducis tecum to Mr. Ross Murakami and/or the appropriate representative of KMH to provide to this committee a copy of the contract, including any amendments entered into between KMH LLP and the Agribusiness Development Corporation relating to assisting ADC in the financial audit conducted pursuant to Act 28, Session Laws of Hawaii 2019. a description of and timeline of KMH's deliverables to ADC, including when that work was turned over by KMH to ADC. A timeline of when ADC turned over the documents prepared by KMH to Acuity, a copy of KMH's draft management discussion and analysis to ADC, and any communications with ADC regarding the management discussion and analysis. And then communications related to the leases, licenses, revocable permit, or other agreement with Hana Hana Puni Farm, Hawaii Labor Solutions Incorporated, and Koke'e Farms, which were identified in the letter of December 17th, 2021 to this committee. Members, my request is that I be allowed to work with the affected interested party here, KMH. That last item could be very broad. So what we're actually looking for is just kind of a summary of the status of those leases and licenses for those Kauai parcels. And so I really want to work with them. We don't need all of the emails that went back and forth that says, thank you, Happy New Year, those types of things. We really want kind of a summary as to where those Kauai parcels are with respect to KMH's understanding of the status of those parcels. My request, members, is that this be delivered to the committee via email to my office Friday, 9:00 a.m. My understanding is that Mr. Murakami and KMH already has many of the documents already prepared and ready for us. So this will give them more than ample time. Members, any questions about this? Yes, Mr. Kobayashi.
So if we're going to be, I still have the question. If I'm going to be asked to vote on whether it's okay to issue a subpoena for this, I feel like I should kind of know why. What came to light at this point that is prompting us to continue to follow up on these Kauai issues? What changed?
What changed was Mr. Murakami on December 17th changed his testimony that had been provided to this committee under oath.
He just said he changed all he did is clarify the date of the completion of the audit.
He changed and corrected it, and we don't know what has transpired. In addition, we have learned that Mr. Kondo communicated with the financial audit partner of KMH, prompting the change in this testimony. I've answered your question, Mr. Kobayashi.
I just need a clarification. When you say the financial audit partner, is that Ross Murakami?
No, it is Wilcox Choi. Thank you. All right, members, any other further questions or discussions about the issuance of this subpoena ducis tecum? Seeing no further questions or conversation or discussion, Vice Chair, ready for the vote.
Chair's recommendation is to issue the subpoena ducis tecum as noted. Chair, Vice Chair vote aye. Representative Hashem? Aye. Representative Kobayashi?
No.
Representative Perruso?
Aye.
Representative Tarnas?
Aye.
Representative Yamashita?
Aye.
Representative Okimoto is excused. Chair, the recommendation is adopted.
Thank you. Members, I'm going to take up the second subpoena ducis tecum. Again, with a similar caveat that I'd be allowed to work with the representative from ADC to request the drafting of the language so that they are able to comply. The timeline will be the same, and the request for this subpoena ducis tecum will mirror the very first request, the first four requests that had been drafted for the KMH. So copies of contracts, descriptions of timelines of turning over documents, and a copy of the latest draft management discussion and analysis. The two additional documents, or the two additional sets of documents that we're going to be requesting is a copy of any license, lease, or revocable permit with Hana Hana Puni Farm, including any amendments. The final category will be a brief explanation of the status of any and all licenses, leases, or revocable permits with Hana Hana Puni Farm at the time the audit was started, and the current status of the license, leases, revocable permit, or other agreements with Hana Hana Puni Farm as of January 10th, 2022. That is today's date. Members, any questions or concerns about this subpoena ducis tecum? Seeing no questions, Vice Chair for the vote.
Chair's recommendation is to issue the subpoena duces tecum as noted. Noting Representative Okimoto excuse any reservations or no's.
Oh, sorry, I can't hear you.
Any reservations or no's?
No.
No for Representative Kobayashi. Everyone else? Other hands. Chair recommendation is adopted.
Vice Chair, thank you. Thank you, committee members. All right, we have that taken off of our agenda, so that is very helpful. Next up, we will return to our discussion of the draft report. Noting some of the concerns that Representative Kobayashi has pointed out, members, I just want to go again over the process. So our rules require a draft report to be provided to interested persons. That report was provided on December 30th, 2021. It was also provided with a letter to all of the subpoenaed witnesses that the draft report at that time was not a public document. Distribution of this draft report was only being made to committee members, designated committee staff, subpoenaed witnesses, and their counsel. I did note, members, in that letter, as you have seen, any unauthorized disclosure of this draft report while the committee is still completing its work will be considered a violation of Rules 4.4 and Rule 4.5 of the committee's rules. I will note that this committee did receive, as well as all members of the legislature received a letter from Mr. Kondo disclosing a portion of that report to all of the members. That was not an authorized action. I just want to raise this because it does raise some concerns that Mr. Werdeman, Ms. Johnson, and Mr. Kondo, who is himself an attorney, may not have complied with the letter and request and the rules of this committee. I will point that out. Now, we are going to have a discussion about this draft report. It is the intent of this chair that this draft report will be made available publicly to all, to the public, at the completion of our audit and upon its presentation to the State House of Representatives pursuant to the resolution. I will state that in Mr. Kondo's letter, he stated that this was an incomplete report. Yes, members, it is a draft report, a draft report. And this is a new process for this committee. We have not seen a Chapter 21 committee convene. And so this is a draft report. I will note that the section that is related to Mr. Kondo's, but of course there are sections, and I think the ABC report, which is part of the report that Mr. Kondo disclosed unauthorized, is something that we're going to discuss, and there's open questions that this committee has to discuss, because I don't think that it would have been appropriate to have put into the draft report when it was such an open question, what that status of the recommendation would be. So members, that is just a little bit of background. And so what we're going to do, members, is we're going to have a discussion about the draft report. You all have copies of it. I'm looking at the December 30th draft report. And the way I'd like to propose we do this is, just so that it's orderly, is we will go through each of the committees, each of the chapters, beginning with chapter 1, and the primary recommendation is in chapter 1, actually, and I would like to get members' thoughts on this, is the question that was open about the membership of this committee, of this chapter 21 committee. Then we will proceed chapter by chapter through each of these, this report, to gain any further insights and discussion points about how we might want to finalize this report. Members, any questions? Okay, seeing none. So we will take this up, and then at the appropriate time at 10:30, because we do have Mr. Murakami and his attorney scheduled, we will take a break, bring them in, conduct that testimony, and hopefully move through that expeditiously, and then come take another recess, and then come back and finalize our conversation and discussion. Any questions about this process, members? Okay, seeing none. So members, first up on chapter 1, it's really just background information, and just as by way of background, a lot of this is taken from our resolution, the findings of the report. There is a section in here about language about the right of subpoenaed witnesses to submit questions, comment on draft report. Members, that's all additional language about our rules and process. And so our staff will be working on that. Okay. Another second open question, members, was the time that this committee had to conduct a full Chapter 21 investigation has as we've already discussed, presented some challenges. So I wanted to get some insights on these Chapter 21 committees, as well as comments about maybe membership and whether or not subject matter chairs should serve on these investigative committees or anything in this chapter number. So I just want to kind of open it up to the floor to see any thoughts or comments. Representative Tarnas.
Thank you, Chair. I would definitely encourage that subject matter chairs are included on investigative committees that are looking at matters under their jurisdiction, because it helps me as a subject matter chair learn more about these issues and be able to engage. So I would encourage that be a standard practice going forward.
Thank you. Any other discussion points? Representative Perruso, I'm going to look at you because you're probably the most junior member. You were vice chair. I think one of the concerns is that maybe we needed to have more junior members also be members of this committee. Do you have any thoughts on that, or any vice chairs? Any thoughts on that?
No, I mean, I think that it's possible that there were other people interested and who would have been willing to commit part of their interim to doing this work. But I think that the subject matter chairs and vice chairs are the most likely because they'll be dealing with that subject matter during the session as well.
Okay. All right. Any further discussion? So there's a timing issue, and I believe Representative Perruso, you and I had discussed about this, but what I found of value with this is that we were able to delve into topics and longstanding issues. It may not always be at the as a follow-up to a specific audit. I mean, when we look at congressional investigative committees elsewhere, we see kind of a variety. And I guess one of the questions I have is that moving forward, if we were to do something like this and pick a topic of deep concern to the legislature, what are your thoughts on creating a standing special committee, much like how Congress has it, that could work over a 2-year time frame versus really what was just the interim of 1 year? Any thoughts on that? So that could be a standing special committee. Go ahead.
I have strong thoughts, or many thoughts about that, because I think that we just began to touch some of the issues that are connected and actually connect the two audits. And I don't think that we really had time to go into those questions and address those questions in a way that would do them justice. So I would petition for a longer time period.
Any other thoughts? Go ahead, Representative Kobayashi.
Thank you, Representative. So the time frame that we're talking about was really not the issue here. In my mind, really the scope of what we're looking at is a thing to talk about. That we had a resolution done that every member voted for. That I don't think there's any question when you look at it. Says we should form an investigative committee to investigate auditor's findings on these two agencies, which were very egregious, not to investigate the auditor. And we've expanded the scope based on some interpretation of other matters in that resolution to say that really one of the primary focus of this has been to go after the department that really came up with the findings that we are formed to investigate, that my colleagues in the House voted on for us to do. I really question whether any of the votes for that resolution were from people who expected this to happen, where we would look at anything except the findings from those two agencies. So really that overreach on scope of what we're supposed to be doing is issue, not necessarily the time that we have to work with. If we limit it to the scope of the audit findings on SODR and ADC, we'd have plenty of time.
Thank you, Mr. Kobayashi. Any comments? First, Chair Tarnas and Vice Chair.
Thanks. No, and I appreciate the concern that has been expressed about the committee following up on questions and things that we've learned about the audit, whether it was conducted and included everything that we had wanted it to include. So when I was at the Council of State Governments West conference, there was a special session that was held about oversight committees. And I asked the question, I said, well, what if during conduct of, in this oversight committee, if we're focusing on an audit, that we end up having questions about the auditor or the way the audit was conducted, things that were omitted. Is it appropriate for the investigative committee to follow up and actually inquire more and investigate about the audit itself and the office of the auditor? And the response I got was absolutely. That is within the jurisdiction and the responsibility of the oversight committee. It may be very unpopular, as this was a quote from another rep who was there, who had a lot of experience in this, but she said it was very appropriate. So I think that it would be good for us to learn from how other states operate their oversight committees. There was a report done for CSG West, or for CSG as a national organization, done by an institute out of the University of Michigan, and I can get you the reference to it, where they made recommendations about best practices. And it was clear that a standing committee, it may be the most efficient way for us to proceed, rather than something that's just ad hoc formed. We all learned through this process. It was on the job training. And I think it would behoove the House to have something a little more formalized, and we could actually be able to, address some of these complicated issues in a much more orderly fashion.
Thank you, Chair Tarnas. Vice Chair?
I did want to modify my previous statement. What I was referring to was the question that emerged around ceded lands. And thinking about it a bit more, I do think that that kind of question, maybe it's not best addressed by this particular committee. So maybe a different committee should be formed to look at that question that might include members of the House Judiciary Committee and so on. And I think that maybe it's true that I think we should both have a standing committee, but then also have some flexibility in terms of the membership so that it's appropriate for the questions as the direction of the investigation changes. I don't know if that's possible, but that seems to me to be most productive.
I think one of the things as we move forward, as Chair Tarnas has suggested, that we look to what other legislatures and Congress does, because there's a mix. There's both standing committees investigating, as well as then committees that are tasked and created specifically. I can think of some right off the top of my head, January 6th committee right now in Congress, or the committee that followed up on the sexual abuse of the gymnast. So there are different kinds of committees, and so we can certainly look into that. And I'll explore that and drop some of those things potentially in as references. We will work to endeavor to add some of these things. Any other discussion on this section? Okay, all right. Any just other conversations about this chapter, members, and then we'll turn to chapter 2, the SLDF section. Okay, members, we're making good time, so we have another about 20 minutes to go for DLNR. I believe we'll start this and then we'll pick it up after we have the testimony of Mr. Murakami. Members, this portion of the committee report is, I think, actually one of the better organized ones, really focusing on a lot of the things that we talked about. They're just going through this section. We spent a good deal of time on strategic planning. In that section, members, there was some comments about noting the recently adopted practice in, I believe, 2019. We're going to add that information where the Board of Land and Natural Resources now annually goes county by county in reviewing of those, I keep getting confused, RPs, I believe, correct? Is that
Yes.
correct, Chair Tarnas?
Yes.
Again, and then there is sections, the next open question, members, is a question about should there be any comment, discussion, or recommendation on conflict of interest training by board members? Since there was an insinuation in the audit report that board members may have acted inappropriately. This goes to that recommendation, members, on page 6 of the draft report that the committee recommends DLNR strengthening its training for members of DLNR on the state's open meetings laws, ethics, and Native Hawaiian law, and add training sessions on contested case hearings, the procurement code, and individual sessions with the leadership of each DLNR division, bureau, and office. Members, any discussion on this section or thoughts on stronger conflict of interest training in light of the audit report findings?
Chair. After listening to the testimony, I think that the conflict of interest training is sufficient and the availability of the deputy AG at every meeting and for consultation. So I don't think that there was a lack of training that resulted in that one board member's comments. I think it was just that one board member.
Okay.
And the other board members commented about it as if, yeah, that was just that board member who had his own style, way of doing things. But I do think that the other training that we've suggested in here is important, and we're expanding it slightly. We're expanding it to include some other things like training on contested case hearing and procurement code that they don't get right now. And I think they really do need to get it. I do think the individual sessions with each of the different divisions, bureaus, and offices is valuable. And I think that's something they should make standard practice. But I don't think that we need to have a recommendation that specifies a conflict of interest training, because I do think that they already got that covered.
Okay. So would you recommend that maybe instead of strengthen, we say continue the training as an acknowledgement that they in fact had that training all along?
Yes, and that they have access to the deputy AGs when questions about these conflicts arise. I think we could, that's worth it to put that language in there.
Okay.
They continue that work.
Any other comments or on this section? Because I know conflicts of interest were something that came up. Okay, members, the next section has to do with a series of recommendations on leases and revocable permits, inspections, negotiations, extensions. Members, with all of this, you know, there are going to probably might be sections where we can fold in things together, but I think each of these were topics that came up and drew some attention. There is a question right up front about the leases and revocable permits that, you know, this area has been complex because the extension of leases is actually not just governed by one statute, but numerous statutes. And so I wanted to just open up to that discussion. Chair Tarnas, I know you might have some comments or thoughts.
Yeah, and I think later we have the recommendations about standardizing, regularizing the lease extensions for all leases, because right now it's a patchwork, and it is unfair to the state and the lessees. It makes more work to have different ways of doing lease extensions. I think so. Our recommendation that comes later, where we standardize all of lease extensions in 171. Is something that we should emphasize and have all of our recommendations there rather than split up into different parts. So in this section here on page 6, I think it would be good for us to note that to achieve what we've talked about here will require a change in legislation regarding all these different types of lands. But please, I would suggest that we refer the reader to the section below on all the statutory changes to 171.
Okay, and that, you know, again, we might be able to just actually move that
Or move,
front
the-
forward.
we could move the whole thing forward, yeah. I don't want to have multiple recommendations on the same thing in multiple places. So yeah, if it's better to consolidate them, I'm all for that too.
Any thoughts, comments on that, members? And I think, part of that later section actually goes through the different acts that demonstrate the
Which
different.
is helpful.
Yeah, and so if we put that and move that more up front, that could provide actually better context.
Okay.
I'm wondering too, if we might make a recommendation here or in the later section about standardization across agencies, because I think that one of the difficulties we're encountering is that the ADC, for example, uses very different criteria, and I think that there is good reason to ask them, for example, to complete EAs before the termination of a lease. If we were to have that be a standard practice for DLNR, but not for Department of Ag or ADC, I think that could be problematic because oftentimes these lands are going back and forth. They're swapped, So I'd like us to consider, a single lease or license template, or at least the same components. Similar.
Tarnas?
I would just say that all agencies that are using 171 will all be required to follow the same process. If the legislature has exempted some other agency from Chapter 171, then they've got their own separate sort of system. I think it'd probably be best for us to try to tackle Chapter 171 first,
Okay.
and let's try to get that standardized within Chapter 171. And then if there's particular concerns about agencies that have been exempted from 171, then we should address that separately. That's just my sense of it.
I think that's a very methodical approach, but we have seen the challenges raised by the movement of lands between different agencies and then what happens when different authorities govern. So point is well taken, and I think it's very good. Go ahead.
And if I could just, as another example of this, we have this whole issue with Act 90, right?
Yes.
But it's because DLNR and DOA have slightly different ways of negotiating things. So sometimes that's because of so there are examples where it is different between two different agencies, and DOA has their own advantages, and so right now we're dealing with this on an agency by agency basis. Then if we can just standardize 171, I think we will be making some big progress.
Okay, so I will work with the kind of conversation that I'm hearing here, but I think that this is good for topics. Representative Kobayashi, did you have any comments? No. Okay, moving on, members. Again, these are more like kind of one-offs within the areas of lease practicing. Any comments, questions about inspections? And we don't have to exhaust our conversation here, members. If you do have other things that you just think about later, you can just, as we've done, you can email me or call me, and we can also just one-on-one discuss your concerns. I'm looking at pages 7 and 8 now. Members, I want to call attention to the section on nonprofits. This came forward from one of the members that they raised the question of how we handle nonprofits. And because we hadn't really talked about this, but there was some testimony that had been provided concerning nonprofits, I was a little bit not sure about how to deal with this, and therefore that's why there is that question. I think we received some testimony from DLNR in the process of our gathering testimony that certain nonprofits are considered. I think they were talking about a food bank in a certain area, and that when we were talking about these leases, RPs, I mean, there's a large range of nonprofits that may be interacting with DLNR. So you have that food basket, but then as I understand it, Sand Island Business Association, for example, is a nonprofit organization, which has a very different kind of relationship with DLNR than the food basket has. I also am aware of, in many members' districts, there might be like parcels of like farmland or hiking trails that might have nonprofits that are managing them. So I was not sure how to deal with this section about the preference that should be given to nonprofits. And I didn't want to make any recommendations unless we had a further discussion about it. So any thoughts, members? I'm going to look to Chair Tarnas first.
Well, I would just give you my opinion that I think DLNR should have they should be permitted to give a discount to a nonprofit if they decide that the public purpose of that nonprofit merits it. So I don't want to eliminate that ability of DLNR to do it, but they need to discern, is the public purpose of such a value that the nonprofit merits a discount? Let's leave that up to DLNR. I don't want to take that ability away from them.
Okay. Any other thoughts on this, members?
I agree in principle, but I do think that that nonprofit structure has been exploited and really not used for its intended purpose in some cases. And I worry that the state is we're the ones who are left with the deficit if we're working with actors who exploit that opportunity for their own benefit, and then we are losing out on revenue. So I just wanted to add that, like, as a cautionary note to DLNR and to the other agencies that do offer these discounts.
So something I would also add to this would be that maybe rather than elimination, we ask DLNR to examine its practices around its relationships with nonprofits and consider, so that it's not such a hard and fast rule. One, in part because we were not able to explore this issue. The audit touched on it. There was some evidence of why there is a public purpose and a need for these kinds of discounts. But then on the flip side, we heard from Mr. Ranchigi that there was some concerns that DLNR may have relationships with nonprofits that had lost their nonprofit status. So then it called into questions whether or not the state was somehow being disadvantaged in the relationship. Am I characterizing kind of the conversation, members? And I can work with that language so that maybe we have an examination of its practices.
Yeah, I'm fine with that. And I think emphasizing that the public purpose of the nonprofit needs to be evaluated to determine whether it merits a discount.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, committee members. Members, we do have Mr. Ross Murakami here, but I also noticed it's 10:22, so I'm going to go push a little bit further so we can get a little bit further on this discussion. Then we'll take a break right around 10:30, and then we'll come back and make sure that Mr. Murakami is ready, and then we will go and move forward. Members, there is a section on page 9 and 10. Again, this is about lease extensions. Because the auditor spent time on certain case studies, there's a question there about focusing in on a particular lease, or should we comment just generally? I look to this committee for some guidance on that question. Chair Tarnas?
Yep, thank you for that. My sense is that I don't think we need to go into anything specific to the KIA leases. I think we need to, we're focusing on the overall changes to 171. And I think that's really where I want to keep the focus.
Okay. Any other thoughts, members? And again, you can come back to me later.
Yeah, I mean, I would just express the concern that to the extent that Chapter 171 also addresses ceded lands, that standardization of that process could be problematic. So I will just let that comment sit.
Okay, is that because there is concerns that some of the KIA lands may in fact be ceded lands?
And I'm not even referencing KIA lands, just
okay.
If we're actually seeking to standardize all leases under 171, and if that captures ceded lands, then I think that we have issues that we need to discuss with respect to that.
Fair enough, members. And I do think that in this report, in this draft report, there is another section where we touch on and have questions about ceded lands, public land trust. And so we can come back and revisit that. Members, one more question and then we'll take a break. There is a section at pages 13 and 14 about policies and procedures. Again, this goes into documents that we had received, testimony that the land division does do policies and procedures. I don't know if there was any other policies and procedures other than the lease extensions, some of the inspections that we had talked about that's previously in the Senate report. I left a placeholder there because I wasn't sure and I didn't want to leave out anything that this committee might be concerned about for policies and procedures that we did not see land division focusing in on. So we might be able to drop this because some of those recommendations about leases and audits that the auditor made specifically, we pick up in the previous sections.
Yeah, and I think we make reference that they already are updating they're tracking the rent procedures, the inspection guidance. I mean, we could encourage them to complete that and implement it. And I think that's relevant, but I don't think it's not any statutory change that we need to make.
Okay. Any other comments? Representative Kobayashi, I know you've been very interested in SLDF too. Any thoughts? I know you had been interested in SLDF, so any thoughts on this portion on policies and procedures?
What I have a question on is that are we going to be continuing to do this after this break, or are we going to the witness, or I'm just a little confused on the timing?
Yes, we are going to take a break from this, turn to Mr. Murakami, who is present, and then return back to the discussion of the draft report.
After Ross?
Yes, after
Okay.
Mr. Murakami. So any other questions, Mr. or Chair Kobayashi on policies and procedures section of the draft report?
No, Chair.
Okay, all right, members. We got through 15 pages. We will make this. I know we will do this. I have complete confidence in us. We're going to take a short break, members. It is now 10:26, and we'll reconvene at 10:30. Recess. Good morning, reconvening our House Investigative Hearing Committee. Today is January 10th. This is the hearing that began at 9:30. We are now moving into further testimony, continued testimony of Mr. Ross R. Murakami, who is with KMH LLP. Just as a matter of the record, Mr. Murakami, you are present here under continued testimony for the subpoena that was issued for your appearance before this committee on December 15th, 2021. And what we're going to do is first swear you in as we had done for that committee. So if you could please stand and I will provide the affirmation. Mr. Murakami, do you solemnly swear or affirm that the testimony you're about to give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
Yes.
I will note for the record that Mr. Murakami has answered affirmatively and that he is also joined in the room by his attorney, Mr. David Danks. With that, members, I'll start the questioning and then open it up to further questioning by the committee. Again, this is somewhat unusual, but because we did receive letters from Mr. Murakami dated December 17th and December 27th, altering, changing, correcting, clarifying, we can use whatever verbiage, but there was a change in the testimony provided. And so, Mr. Murakami, my first question to you. Were you or your firm contacted by anyone or was there any communications about your testimony with you or any member of your firm after you provided testimony to this committee on December 15th?
Yes.
Who was that communication with?
Auditor Kondo contacted one of my partners,
And who was that partner he contacted?
Wilcox Choi.
Thank you. Was that communication about the testimony that you provided on December 15th?
Yes.
And what was the date of that testimony? Oh, excuse me, what was the date of that communication between Mr. Kondo and Mr. Choi?
I believe it was on December 15th.
Do you know approximately what time?
It may be the early afternoon of December 15th.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Murakami. Can you explain what Mr. Wilcox Choi's role is in your CPA firm?
Mr. Choi is one of my partners. He oversees the audit practice or the audit division of our firm.
Okay. If Auditor Kondo did not happen to contact Mr. Choi on that day, would you have prepared the follow-up letter to the committee of December 17th?
Probably not.
Okay. Did you ever talk to or communicate with Auditor Kondo after Auditor Kondo's call to Mr. Choi?
No.
Do you know if anyone in your organization communicated with Auditor Kondo between December 17th and December 27th when you provided the second letter to the committee?
I believe Auditor Kondo contacted Mr. Choi again after the 17th.
Do you know how many times he may have contacted, if it was a back and forth? And did Mr. Choi share your first initial letter to Mr. Kondo?
I don't know how many communications did occur. Mr. Choi did not provide Mr. Kondo with a copy of the letter.
How many conversations did you have with Mr. Choi about your testimony before this committee and the two letters that you had drafted and provided to this committee?
I would say maybe 4 or 5 discussions.
Did those discussions happen both before December 17th and after December 17th before you provided the final letter to this committee?
Yes.
Was the second letter of clarification influenced or urged by anyone other than yourself?
Auditor Kondo expressed concerns to Mr. Choi regarding the continued involvement of KMH in the ADC, assisting the ADC with the audit process.
What were those concerns communicated?
That my testimony may have given the impression that we were completely done with the assistance being provided to ADC. And that's not true. We are continuing to be available to assist ADC until the audit process is completed.
Okay, so while that may be correct, Mr. Murakami, is your testimony the same as of December 15th, that you had finished all the work that was considered necessary to complete the audit? Was KMH essentially finished with all the work that was considered necessary to be able to complete the financial audit? And this is the testimony that would have appeared at around 33 minutes within your testimony before this committee.
The letter of December 17th provided clarification on one open item, one open deliverable that we provided to the ADC at the end of September. And that is a draft of the management discussion and analysis document that ADC is required to provide to accompany the final audited financial statements. So we did provide that to ADC at the end of September. And I believe my testimony said summer, I referred to summer of 2021, and that's probably not as accurate as it should have been. So I really wanted to provide a little bit more clarity and more specificity in that response.
I really appreciate that, Mr. Murakami. So again, essentially, the testimony that you had completed all the work necessary, the bulk of the work had been done already. If we were to go back, you're not changing that primary testimony from December 15th, correct?
No, I'm only clarifying that the MD&A wasn't delivered until the end of September.
Okay, and then what is your view on the MD&A as being a critical piece for the completion of your work in order for a QAD to be able to complete its work?
The MD&A is a required component for audits of government entities. But it is also based on the final numbers and disclosures in the financial statement. So it is, although required, it shouldn't stop the process of getting the audit of the financial statements completed. But again, it is a component of that final deliverable.
And again, as part of your testimony on December 15th, Mr. Murakami, you did also indicate that there are techniques used by the CPA firms, auditors in general, government auditors, that when there are open questions, there are ways to deal with those open questions so that you can actually complete a financial audit up to the standards, the Yellow Book government auditing standards that apply to your industry. Is that still your testimony that the financial audit could have been completed?
Auditors are allowed to issue qualified opinions when there are matters that can't be resolved because of uncertainty, because of other limitations to the audit process. If there are disagreements, the auditor is still allowed to issue an opinion on those financial statements. It would be a qualified opinion. So the audit can still be completed, but the audit opinion will not be considered an unqualified or clean opinion.
Thank you, Mr. Murakami. I'm going to open this up to questions to the committee. We'll first open up as we have done in the past. Chair Hashem, you have the first question.
I don't really have, you asked all the questions that I had. I just want to clarify that, Mr. Murakami, your firm is doing other audits, right? So for the state. So the communication was specifically for ADC's audit, and what you're referring to is specifically for the audit that we're working on.
I can't comment on if Mr. Choi had any other discussions with Auditor Kondo regarding ongoing audit engagements, but my comments are restricted basically to comments that Mr. Kondo had about my testimony.
Okay, no, that's all. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair Hashem. Up next, Chair Kobayashi.
Thanks, Chair.
Sorry, I'm just gonna check. It would be House Minority Leader Val Okimoto, but she's not even on Zoom. So Chair Kobayashi, you're up next.
Thank you, Chair. So, Mr. Murakami, maybe you could clarify for me. We have we had a discussion when you first came to testify, and it was kind of focused on a couple of things. You had comments regarding ADC's new system for managing leases, and your comments that that was an improvement, and also that their staffing was better. That was really the material part of your testimony, I believe. So now we're talking about really your part in Acuity finishing their financial audit and the timing related to some of the open items that you have related to that. Does that change any of your testimony regarding really the material part of what you talked about initially regarding ADC's improvements?
Can I clarify that? If you're talking about the management system from the testimony of December 15th, I believe that was the conversation around DLNR's new computing land management system. Did you want to clarify your question, Mr. Kobayashi?
Oh, so I guess in general, the question is that what we're talking about substantially when you first came to testify really didn't focus on the completion of the audit. And I guess I'm a little confused as to why this is a thing here. That you chose to send a letter on December 17th related to this, and now that you're back here to clarify further.
Could you, I'm sorry, could you restate your question?
It just appeared to me that the focus of your testimony initially was not the completion of the audit dates, and now that that's become an issue.
My testimony here today is specifically related to the two subsequent letters that I submitted that were intended to provide more clarity, more accuracy in my statements made on January 15th. There were obviously other components of my testimony that was given at that time, but today I'm really just providing more clarity on the reasons for those two letters.
Okay, and the other issue that's being brought up is a discussion your business partner, I assume, is what we're talking about, had with the auditor. And that's something that came up subsequent that you're also here to discuss with us. Is that kind of why you're back here? Or?
I'm here to respond to questions that the committee has. I believe the committee is the first question to ask was whether there were any communications. So I'm providing response to that. But again, my focus is the two letters that I submitted and the reasons for those two letters.
Okay.
So I was not party to any of those conversations with Mr. Cuomo.
Yeah, because I think if that was the focus, we would have your partner show up here as well, right, to answer it himself. Thank you.
On that note, Mr. Kobayashi or Chair Kobayashi, what I would note is that we did not subpoena Mr. Wilcox Choi because of the timeline of this committee. But I think some of the serious questions raised by the conduct now could implicate if there are further investigations into this matter. So at this point in time, I would actually encourage Mr. Murakami as the representative of KMH, because what you've revealed today raises some serious concerns about conduct that has occurred, that no communications between anyone in your office, including Mr. Choi and the auditor, be destroyed. All communications, emails, text messages, letters, memos, other communications need to be preserved at this time in the event that there might be further investigations into this matter that will not be conducted by this committee, but that may occur because of this occurrence of now multiple conversations that we know that have occurred between Mr. Kondo and the financial audit partner of your firm. Do you understand that, Mr. Murakami?
Yes,
And that can be conveyed to the partners in your firm?
I will convey that to my partners.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Murakami. Next up for questioning is Mr. Yamashita, I believe, and then Mr. or Chair Chair Tarnas. Chair Tarnas, for questions.
No questions, thanks.
Vice Chair Perruso.
I don't have any questions per se, but I think that this conversation really reflects the committee's concern about the failure of ADC to complete the financial audit. And so that's why the timing of your relationship with ADC on that issue matters. And so I just want to be very clear about that this is the audit of 2019 ADC records. It's 2022, and we still have no end date in sight in terms of when we're going to see whether or not their records or they will even pass an audit or get an unqualified audit. I frankly very much doubt it. And I feel like it's being prolonged so as to obfuscate. So that's my frustration and why I was curious about that additional conversation. So just to make you aware.
I would add to that comment, Mr. Murakami, that this is another reason why we are requesting the documents of the timeline to see when the work and the deliverables were completed. Because as I suspect, and I hope will be confirmed by the documents that you will turn over, that the bulk of the work, as you have testified on December 15th, was in fact completed. And that there are ways in which the Office of the Auditor, if they are complying with Yellow Book standards, could have completed the financial audit and provided it to the legislature as a whole in a timely manner. As you will also note, Mr. Murakami, as you received a copy of the draft report, we do have a specific, actually numerous sections that actually touch upon some of the work of KMH and Acuity. So this is critical. This additional information is critical for us to be able to fill out those aspects of the report where we make recommendations that the financial audit be immediately released if at all possible, going to Vice Chair Perruso's concerns. That's just comment. You can respond or you can choose not to respond to any of that.
I understand your comments and represent Perruso's comments.
And you will also be, you have seen the direction of this committee on some of the concerns about the timeliness of the financial audit. So if you want to respond to that, you also had received a letter that you're welcome to submit any comments to the committee in response to the draft report and those sections that may be affected or affect KMH specifically. So you do have that option as well, Mr. Murakami. Vice Chair Ichiyama for your questions.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Mr. Murakami, for coming back today. I really appreciate it. I just want to make sure that I understand the timeline of events. Are you okay to hear? Are you hearing me okay?
Yes.
Okay. So you testified before this committee on December 17th. I'm sorry, December 15th. And is that correct?
Correct.
And then that day, your partner received a call from Auditor Kondo, I guess, raising some concerns about your testimony. And then in response to those concerns, you wrote a letter to this committee on December 17th.
Correct.
And then apparently somehow Mr. Kondo found out about that letter, was not satisfied with it, again contacted Mr. Choi at your firm, and that led to the second letter of December 27th.
Correct.
Okay. What I'm confused about is, and maybe if you don't know this answer, that's fine. How did Mr. Kondo get a copy of or understand the contents of the December 17th letter?
He did not get a copy of the letter, but we did share with him what my letter would contain, what what type of language it would include.
I see. Okay, so he understood the contents of it through a verbal conversation.
Correct.
I see. Okay, thank you so much for that clarification. Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
I have a follow-up question. Thank you, Vice Chair. Who was a party to that conversation with Mr. Kondo?
It was between Mr. Kondo and Wilcox Choi.
So Mr. Choi conveyed what was the intent of your correction or clarification to Mr. Kondo. You were not part of that conversation.
I was not part of the conversation.
Okay, thank you. Any further questions? We'll go through our final round. Again, members in preparation. And I don't see our final member on the Zoom, so we'll just go to the folks in the room. Representative Hashem.
No questions.
Representative Kobayashi.
No questions.
Representative Tarnas.
No questions.
Representative Yamashita. Representative Perruso.
No questions.
And Representative Ichiyama. Thank you, Mr. Murakami, for your testimony. I don't believe we have any further testimony. At the earlier part of this hearing, we took a vote as a committee for the issuance of a subpoena ducis tecum. You'll be able to go online immediately and view this committee hearing to see what we discussed. But this committee has granted me the flexibility to be able to massage that language about this subpoena ducis tecum. It does contain what we had discussed previously as the documents related to your December 27th letter. And then there's other language in there that I'd like to kind of massage further about documents related to the 3 Kauai parcels. I don't want all the documents you may have on those 3 Kauai parcels. So I'm been given authority by this committee to kind of work through that draft language for that subpoena ducis tecum. And following this hearing, we will contact your offices and your attorney to work that out. But I also understand that you have some of those documents already ready for us. Do you understand that question and the comments?
Yes, I do.
Okay. Members, seeing no further questions for Mr. Murakami, I think we can dismiss him. Again, Mr. Murakami, you will receive a Zoom link for our final meeting, which will occur on Tuesday, January 18th. And you are welcome to both participate and log on via Zoom, or the final meeting of this committee will also be on Olelo and on the House YouTube channel. Seeing no further questions or comments, we're going to take a recess and we're going to thank and dismiss Mr. Murakami from this committee. You are dismissed and we are going to take a brief recess. We'll come back in 5 minutes, members. Good morning. We are reconvening the House Investigative Committee. Today is Monday, January 10th. This is the 2022. This is the meeting that was scheduled for 9:30 a.m. and we are continuing our discussion of the draft report. Members, we left off the discussion of the SLDF section, and I want to turn to Representative Tarnas, who had some comments on page 12, where we discussed the recommendations surrounding rent appraisals and such.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, I would just recommend that we change the language under the recommendation to track what the sentence is at the end of the commentary paragraph, so that it would be, the committee recommends that the lessee should have the option of paying for the appraisal and the rent reopening during a lease extension, but then not be given the opportunity to contest the appraisal.
Okay, so consistency of the recommendation is what I'm hearing from.
Yes,
Chair
yeah,
Tarnas.
and the way the recommendation is written, it just says that the lessee be required to pay. And I just want to say they'd be given the option of paying. But if they do that, then they give up the opportunity to contest the appraisal. I think that would reflect what DLNR suggested. And I think that's a good recommendation. This is on page 12, bottom.
Thank you. Okay, members, any other comments on this part of the Special Land and Development Fund chapter? Okay, seeing none, members, the next section that has some open questions is the concerns that have been raised about public land trust and ceded land revenues. I know this concern crosses both agendas and raises some interesting issues. It was from the DLNR audit that we actually got further documents and insights into public land trust and how ceded land revenues are actually held and dealt with by the entire state as a whole. So I just kind of wanted to open up this. I think it was a testimony actually from Chris Ewan. Yes, Chris Ewan, who was a board member of DLNR, who had a very good discussion about the conflation of these very, very important ideas in the report. And so I was kind of responding to that. I'd like to open up for some discussion, and Chair Tarnas, I'll defer to you first.
Yeah, I think that Chris Ewan, board member Ewan, actually described it in a way that would be more useful, because I think the audit was confused in some of these areas. And so it was confusing in some of the way it was described. So I would suggest that we use some of the language that's coming directly out of board member Ewan's testimony.
Okay. Any other thoughts on this? And I'm going to look.
And let me just mention as well that we had, there was reference made by board member Ewan to a deputy AG letter that we had gotten a copy of, but because it's, we were just provided this and it's not for publication. But I think the arguments in that letter are ones that it'd be good for us to be able to explain and disclose if we can get permission for doing that, because I know that was the whole basis behind their decision to do it the way we, by depositing the money into the SLDF, that it was appropriate. And I think that's relevant. And if we could include that language, it'd be useful. Sorry to interrupt, but
No,
I
that's
wanted
right.
to finish that.
On that document, I will take that under advisement. I'd like to proceed very carefully in this area because this spans how the state as a whole handles this very sensitive and important. I want to stress a very, very important issue with respect to ceded land. So Vice Chair Perruso.
Yeah, so I did want to say that while there may have been some terminology issues in the audit, I think that the auditor pointed to a really important problem, and that is around ceded land revenues and whether or not it is legitimate, a legitimate practice for DLNR to simply pay the OHA and DHHL pro rata and then retain the remainder of all of those funds for themselves. So I think that's an open question. I think that the that Deputy AG's memo, so remembering that Deputy AG is responsible to the department and is defending the department's position. So it's no surprise that it is a rationalization of the existing practice. I don't think that that puts it outside of our purview. I don't think that that makes it sacrosanct. And I think that it, not only should that memo be subject to public scrutiny and challenge, but that this question should be the subject of an additional, an outside or an additional inquiry, because we're clearly not going to be able to address it. We're, you know, focusing on the 2 audits, but it's so important. And it does also address those thousands of acres that ADC has control over. So, and ADC has never, until just recently, paid any pro rata to OHA or any, you know, measure of the ceded land revenues back to the state. So it's an enormous question, but I don't think we really settle in the report by just referencing Chris Ewan's testimony. I think that it's a much bigger issue.
Okay. Any other comments or questions? Can I want to make sure, because from what I recall of the testimony from SLDF, my understanding is that might be actually some statutory language that actually directs them that the rest of the monies have to go back into the SLDF. So I just want to put that as a question out there, but we will go back and backtrack that.
Yeah, I mean, I think even the deputy AG's memo says that there's not specific statutory language that provides that direction, but then they use a variety of other legal arguments to defend the practice.
Okay, I will look at it because I feel like that was a very specific piece of testimony. So SLDF or the land division was only trying to comply with the law. I also recall from the testimony that at the end of the day, the pro rata share that DLNR pays in total actually covers more than what they actually owe for the 20%. And so that they cover, when you look at the entire share that goes over to OHA, is that they're covering other agencies, i.e. that
Right,
concern that you have about
right,
ADC.
So I think my question is, and I think it's other members share my concern, that those revenues are not subject to legislative scrutiny, that we are basically giving away our authority, right? And that those monies should go back to the general fund so that they can go to the purposes for which we designate.
Okay. Members, anything else to add to this conversation? Was there any, okay. So is there a specific recommendation? I hear the recommendations I hear coming from this discussion is some discussion of the of how public land trust revenues are now currently being used and how it's being distributed, whether or not it's pursuant to at least the SLDF portions one as well, whether it's, I'd like to follow up with that question about whether they're actually statutorily required to return it back to SLDF. And that this area should be subject of additional inquiry because it goes across agencies is what I heard. All right, thank you. This is helpful. So this will help us flesh out this area for the SLDF fund. Members, there's some sections on the accounting records, and this goes to some of the information that we received from Mr. Murakami on December 15th. I had questions here. We were provided with NNK completed audits for those years of 2017, 2018, 2019, so I'll follow up with that. Corrections. I don't see anything else here. Anything to add to this section? I do believe, I went back and looked at some of the testimony provided to by Mr. Murakami. There was some discussion of the movement from SLIMS to Voyager. We can note that in this because I do think that it helps them better with their accounting practices potentially. So we'll focus on that. But any thoughts on that? Okay, members, the last section of this are on the unreported issues that came up or omissions. Any comments on this areas? Or is this generally? Consistent with recommendations that members of this committee have. So the three main areas were the failure to follow up on contracts, grants, and memorandum of understanding pursuant to the resolution that authorized the scope of this statute. The forged easement discovered on Kauai and the request that they recommendation that DLNR Attorney General complete that to remove the forged easement, and then further follow up on the potential loss of nonprofit status. Oh, go ahead.
That's fine. No, I'm in agreement with the language that you have in here, so no suggested changes.
Rep. Kobayashi, go ahead.
Is this chapter 4 you're talking about? I'm not clear.
No, it's chapter 2. We're still on the SLDF fund. Yes.
The section regarding the forged easement on page 18, I'm not sure, maybe I'm not seeing it here, maybe I'm missing it. Just to note that the committee found that that easement was still part of the public record. I think that just leads to the emphasis of the committee's recommendation that DLNR and the Attorney General work to expunge that document as a public record.
Okay, thank you very much. That so noted. Okay, thank you, members. And again, if as you're reading through this, something pops up, you can always just call me or email me any of your thoughts, observations, insights. Okay, members, moving to chapter 3, the Agribusiness Development Corporation section. Members, this one was a little bit more difficult. I think in part because there were so many recommendations and we never really quite got a handle on how we were going to deal with this one. The findings had been, in the auditor's report, had been put into 4 different categories. I just want to refresh your recollection. The findings that I read from the auditors was, and it's repeated in the first part of our chapter 1, is that the findings were that ADC had done little to fill the void left by exit of sugar and pineapple. Land management struggles expose the state to risk. ADC provides minimal guidance and oversight of its, I believe its executive director and staff, and the financial records were not auditable. Those were the kind of 4 major finding topic areas of the auditor. And then there were numerous, actually way more recommendations in this. And there was some agreement, I think, between members of this committee, some disagreement, some concerns raised. So when we were organizing this chapter initially, it was very difficult to do. So there are more probably organizational problems with this. But if you might indulge with me, if you had read the entire chapter completely, there really is kind of like 3 areas we could probably consolidate all these into. The section about enabling legislation is really about authorizing legislation, the mission, planning, all of those kind of mission-driven questions about the ADC. Then there's a second kind of area of topics around policies. And then the third area around the financial audit. And I think we could consolidate these into those 3 areas and move some of these around so that it mirrors more the structure of the SLDF audits. And then I'm sorry, a 4th area. So it would be kind of authorizing, enabling legislation, recommendations around policies and procedures, and then financial records, auditability of financial records, and then finally areas of unreported issues or omissions. Okay, so on that note, members, why don't we have a discussion about the authorizing language? I feel like there was a lot of consensus that the authorizing statute needs to be revised with things that are done mostly by DOA or other agencies could be deleted. Anyone want to have any more thoughts on this authorizing section?
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Under bullet point 2, where you are kind of proposing alternatives, either setting requirements regarding the production or aligning plans and projects with reasons to set goals. I prefer the latter language because setting requirements just gives them something to game. And I think that asking for that alignment and to be able to defend the alignment gives us much stronger planning.
Okay.
I don't know if other folks have other perspectives on that, but
Can you say that again? I'm looking, members, we're looking at page
Yeah.
24.
no, I'm on page 20, actually, because it's the first, or like the yellow highlighted thing on page 20.
Okay, wait, hold on.
Um,
Oh, okay.
It's about the authorizing statute. But it's just basically the,
Oh, I see.
you see what I'm saying? So rather than setting specific requirements regarding production of local products for local consumption, I think that if we do that, then we just get into the business of, people seeking loopholes. But if we ask the agency to make sure that all plans and projects are aligned with these goals for purchasing, then we're asking them to think about it in a more holistic way, rather than just hitting specific numbers and thinking about different ways they can do that.
Oh, I see. So actually that language about aligning is more, actually more flexible, members.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, members, there's a whole set of recommendations potentially on planning. Let me go back. So I'm going to continue to work with the language about deletion and repealing of certain portions that are already being done. Members, I will comment that in the many documents that we received from ADC, there's actually a wealth of planning that they do, but their planning seems to be focused on kind of more regional projects.
It's project focused.
It's project focused. So it's not that there's lack of planning, but there was that sense of a lack of an overall plan.
And
And so
I don't think we need to plan for agribusiness for the whole state. We just need them to plan for the lands that they are developing and managing. And I don't know if other people want them to, Chair Hashem, if you thought they should have a more ambitious plan, I don't know.
Well, I agree with that.
I would agree with that too. I think DOA has a responsibility for the whole planning of the state, but they really have the focus of planning, strategic planning for their lands. And then that's when it goes into the alignment of specific projects and plans. Okay, I will work with that language. Members, again, I think this long set of sections of planning, planning facilitation, there was some recommendation in here about selection of providing more resources for them to do planning. Anyone have any thoughts on that? Because there was that question raised, right? Could they do it internally? Did they have the staffing? Could they tap another agency? Rep. Hashem.
I'll speak to that. I talked to Department of Planning, and I also talked to ADC, and both of them don't have the extra capacity to take this on. So I think we should give them funding for them to hire an outside consultant for a one-time basis to come in and help with their planning process.
I think it would be good if it was under Mary Alice Evans.
Yeah, that's fine too. And I brought that up, and putting it under the Department of Planning, she said it's okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so I'll work on some kind of recommendation for that and look to Chair Hashem to work on that. Okay. Chair Hashem, throughout there was also other funding requests for this issue, for this agency. Are there other funding requests that you have?
Yes, since their books are so bad, they should have an audit, not an audit, an accountant position to help them keep their books.
Okay.
Would be very helpful.
Okay.
And also that electronic system that kind of mirrors what DLNR has. They need a land management electronic data system.
Yes. Yes, I talked to ADC about that. They already funded that. I think it cost $500,000, but they funded that and they're going forward on that. Or it's already in the pipeline.
Okay.
So that's why I didn't put that as one of my recommendations.
Can we follow up and make sure that we get some of that language in, because I think it is important. But from what I understand, that system, right, there's a difference between the Yardi system that DLNR have, which is a very complex, robust system because they have so much more lands that they're managing
Right.
versus what ADC may be getting is a more off-the-shelf, potentially
I think
cheaper
they're-
system to
I think
manage.
they're using Yardi.
They are using Yardi, okay. So if, okay, well, maybe this is an area we need to follow up and make sure that.
Yeah, I believe they're going with Yardi.
That will certainly, we'll
But don't hold me on that. And I'm not testifying on that because I may be wrong.
I'm writing it
And I
down.
may have to retract my statements later on.
okay, well, I was sure that, and I see Ms. Yi still on this, and this is a public meeting as well. So if they wanted to comment on that in their response, they can. But like, I think that funding for that continued management system is very important if that's at all at risk as well.
Chair, you mentioned, and I don't, before we get too far down, I did want to circle back to the planning process that you had
Yes.
mentioned. And I know Chair Tarnas was very involved and had a lot of good insight into, planning that engages stakeholders in the agricultural community and in surrounding communities. And I want to make sure that we include language to that effect, even if they hire like an outside planner or we're hiring a position, that position, the intention of the position is to provide for that facilitation. Because I think that so much upset can be avoided with proper engagement. So that is really important to me, or maybe we can discuss that if other people don't think that's important.
I think community stakeholder involvement in any planning process is critical. So Chair Tarnas, you want to comment on that?
No, I appreciate the affirmation that we should include language to that effect in the report. Because I think all of us would agree that stakeholder engagement is essential in any planning process.
Members, on this issue of kind of authorizing legislation, enabling legislation, planning, the approval of plans, I want to move to the question that's open about the delegation of Board of Agriculture Authority for approval of plans, or whether approval should be subject to HRS Chapter 92 at the Board of Agriculture level, not the ADC level, but the Board of Agriculture level, because that is an open question. And my sense was that the explanation about the delegation of authority from board to board as the Board of Agriculture person may change because of the appointment of the Board of Agriculture chair, so that's of the Department of Ag, that members were comfortable with that. And so I want to clarify that that is the position of this committee, that the delegation of authority was acceptable. So the current practice is, or should we impose something differently? I'm going to turn to Chair Hashem first.
I don't know. On my notes for that section. For that section, I just wrote, we need to discuss this further. So I need to think about that a little bit more.
Okay.
Yeah.
I would say, Case, members, that's, the way I fall on this, I think, is that the delegation of authority happens across all kinds of boards in the state. The delegation of board authority happens across, and boards authorities happens across a lot of state agencies. Otherwise, we would not be able to function. So when a board adopts a certain posture, then that carries over to the next board, regardless of who may be changing in the chairs. And so it's actually very standard practice. And I will also say, having reviewed many of these minutes of the Board of Agriculture, every time there were huge plans and projects, the Board of Agriculture actually did weigh in. So when I reviewed the minutes of the Board of Agricultures on some of the larger things, it seems like the big moves that are done by the ADC get board discussion at the Board of Agriculture. They have board discussion or even like acceptance. And so it's working. The board delegation process and communication process is working. So that I don't know that we have to go back to the board all the time. Now, could there be a practice when there is a new chairman of the ADC board that they revisit that policy? Or if there's a change in the Board of Agriculture chair for whatever reason, and it could happen mid-administration, that then they revisit that policy at that particular time, but that shouldn't be something that they have to do every time. I'll throw it out to you guys.
I would say, as someone who has struggled to access ADC meetings, and was only able to consistently view the conversation when COVID hit and they were forced to go online. I struggle with this question because I understand the practicality, but I also understand that with that delegation comes the dropping of a veil. So when items have to be on the Board of Agriculture's agenda, they are open to the public in a way that ADC meetings have not traditionally been. While they may be like technically noticed, ADC does not record their meetings. They do not post them online. The mechanisms in place to allow for public testimony are rudimentary at best. It was better when they were in person, and the public was only really able to participate when those meetings were actually in our community. So I just think that when we think about that delegation of board authority, the benefit of it, of not delegating the authority, is that those items have to go to, like, go to the Board of Agriculture, which means that there are more eyes on it, so you get better outcomes. So that's my only kind of thinking around that. And I think there's a way to kind of address both this issue of practicality. We can't address all, because that would completely overwhelm the Board of Agriculture if every amendment of every license got taken to the board. That's not what I'm calling for. But I think that there has to be some kind of level at which items are required to go and get the approval of the board and be subject to public scrutiny and public review in a way that they are never at ADC meetings. Just because the public doesn't, it's just a different dynamic.
Can I tease something out of, I think, of what some of your concerns are, Vice Chair Perruso? I'm calling you Vice Chair because you're Vice Chair of Agriculture, not Vice Chair of the committee. I want to just clarify that.
You can just call me.
It is a public meeting and people are getting to see this. So I hear the concern being about community participation and also being able to see. And I heard in your comment that, with COVID actually, and this probably applies to so many agencies and boards across the state, the use of now Zoom and remote hearings being broadcast has made community stakeholder engagement actually more possible. So and we have these questions about what should be made Chapter 91 and Chapter 92 throughout this Chapter 3 related to ADC. So could I recommend for that we maybe adopt another recommendation to encourage or require or recommend that ADC continue to hold its meetings in a virtual manner, or adopt, which is going to be hard because we are struggling with this as a legislature, but a hybrid proceeding so that
Or
there can be community.
like neighborhood board meetings. They record the proceedings, the visual, the people viewing it online later or through Lilo can hear the conversation, because what happens with ADC is they post their minutes, which are pretty extensive, but they don't capture tone and they miss a lot.
Yeah.
So when I look at minutes of meetings that I attended, I am surprised. So maybe requiring that they video and post their meeting so that there's a record, a public record that people can reference and catch up on conversations so they understand the basis for the decision making.
So my comment to that would be like, look, we have two agencies in front of us pursuant to this audit investigative committee. Deal and our post all of their Board of Land and Natural Resources, as well as have the minutes. And so, but they're a bigger agency with quite frankly more resources than ADC has. So if I could recommend that, if you allow me to, I'll work on a recommendation about this ability to continue virtual hybrid engagement recording. And then if there needs to be an appropriation, something, so that we can then.
The neighborhood board actually has people there,
We have a contract.
right?
Yeah.
So, I mean, I agree that this is the way of the future, and they probably have no turning back now. It's so easy with YouTube, so they
Okay.
should continue.
Okay, so what I'm hearing again from this discussion is that the Board of Delegation process is okay. We will reaffirm that. And then I will include another section and recommendation about this concerns about community being able to be engaged and hear and know what's happening at ADC.
Is there a way that we can say, you know, for substantive matters or matters that rise to a certain level of public concern, they are required to go to the Board of Ag?
So, Chair, can I make a recommendation?
Yes.
This issue should be dealt with in their policies and procedures. It's
Okay.
spelled out. So if it, they should make their internal policy of what has a threshold, because you don't want to stifle them
Yeah.
to the point where nobody wants to join the board because it becomes a full-time job, right? So, but yet you don't want, I mean, they can do this through their policies and procedure.
Okay, I'm hearing a compromise being set, and I think we can work this out. So I'm going to, but you know, this actually brings us to that portion on written policies and procedures and administrative rules. You know, there's a recommendation that within about 2 years, July 24th, members, and I'm looking at page 29, that the committee recommends that ADC develop written policies and procedures for board oversight. So these are policies and procedures. Adopt administrative rules pursuant to Chapter 91. We're kind of going to this conversation right now. And your view, Chair Hashem, is that maybe Chapter 91 is not appropriate. We should allow them to handle some of these issues at their policies and procedures level.
Well, my view is they need to update their policies and procedures and expand on it and make it more robust and more detailed. But it doesn't necessarily have to be Chapter 91.
I concur with that, in part because, you know, ADC's leases, licenses, revocable permits, right? In some ways, you can view them as a subset of like, or a mirror of the DLNR leases, right? And we know that there are certain good practices that we make reference to, that they should adopt certain things in their licensing practices. That would be like, you know, them creating a standardized license as well.
Yeah,
But
just
what
by-
I worry about is like, they are an agency that was conceived of to be more flexible. So as soon as you apply Chapter 91, given their current status of where some of their licenses and permittees are at, and they have that co-op situation on Kauai, but no co-op situation on Oahu, I just fear this process that we need to give them more time to, as Rep. Hashem says, update their policies and procedures, make them more robust. We give them a timeline maybe of 2023. And then I think the question of administrative rules for specific portions, that needs to be studied further, because we don't understand all the implications for, again, they have, their permittees are all in different places, both on Oahu and Kauai, and we don't know the scope of those differences.
Can I just comment?
Yes, please comment.
I mean, I see the direction of the committee, and I want to just say for the record that I can't really support that direction, because I do think that what the behavior of ADC over the past, I don't know, few decades or at least a couple decades has suggested that they would benefit from additional oversight and the structure of administrative rules and Chapter 91. I feel as though this ADC is the case study of why we don't allow that kind of latitude. And I think that the second paragraph of on page 31, that middle paragraph actually where you're talking about, this is related but not central to the question, about the exchange of rent credits to tenants who offer services. And I think that is just one quintessential example of the potential abuse without administrative rules governing such practices. Because the state then is not only subject to the public perception of corruption when certain tenants benefit because of relationships with existing leadership in ADC while others do not, but also that we have no kind of control over the quality of those services provided by those tenants. And so I think that it kind of goes to this question of flexibility and innovation. And I frankly am very skeptical. I think that those are powers that in this case, it did not behoove the state to grant to ADC. And we are in this committee because of the outcomes. So I understand the reasoning you're being offered, but I just wanted to offer kind of my analysis.
If I can, so, when we look at the documents that are grounding this conversation that's happening, there is a specific list of policies and procedures that ADC has provided with us. It's kind of the problem, correct? And then there's the practices and the known areas, the problematic areas that might need, from certain perspectives, more administrative rules. And so one of the things that I'd like to recommend is that we know what the opposites are, the polars are, but we need to find something that kind of strikes a balance.
Can I ask a clarification question?
Go ahead.
What specifically about Chapter 91 are you referring to?
Oh, well, I'm just saying that they need administrative rules put in place that the public can see. So these policies and procedures, which is what they offer up as their substitute for administrative rules, are of no consolation to the public, not only because they had to go find them, they hadn't been referencing them and they had to go dig them up, and even though they're written back in 2009, but also because there's a clear sense from the public that it's decisions are made on an ad hoc and
So, okay, would a compromise be whatever they come up as in their policies and procedures be listed on their website? Because a lot of departments have their rules, administrative rules on their website.
yeah, but I still think they should be subject to procurement code.
They are subject to procurement.
I know, but I mean, in a way that is like, we are, their policies and procedures kind of reflect that. I don't think that their practices reflect that they're subject to procurement code. I don't think their practices, they have said these practices are not subject to procurement code when in fact they are of material value, so they should be. And that's the example that I'm talking about, is like the use of rent credits.
I don't think that should be. Because if we made, if we made rent credits and tenant improvements a source of procurement, then that has a larger implication with border the transportation, airports, everything else. So that came up in the legislature previously. And because now everything has to be prevailing wage, everything else. So that opens up a huge can of worms, like going down that path. So
Yeah, I mean, I can see
that's
procurement
something
is
really
like,
has to be done,
procurement is something nobody wants to touch.
right? I mean, that's what TIs are for. I
Right.
mean, right?
No, I
It's supposed to be
understand that.
kind of, yeah, TIs are very valuable tool that I think departments can use. And especially for departments that don't have the resources or the funds to make the improvements that are needed.
Yeah.
So like even with DLNR, so when they take back, let's say the conversation was to take back property, they can take back a old warehouse that they want to repurpose back in. They can just go right in and put the old warehouse as is condition and put in, offer tenant TIs to the next lessee. And they don't have to make the improvements. They just have to negotiate the improvements and take it off on the rent credit.
Okay, so
Right, so that, right, and if you make that subject to procurement, all of a sudden, yeah, it's just another huge can of worms that you're opening up.
well, and then the impact is across, you're saying, Chair Hashem, that it's across agencies because right now.
Yes, if we set
Yeah.
precedent here,
Yeah, no,
It's-
I understand that.
right, it's, yeah, you're opening a can of worms.
I think we need to have further discussion and maybe
Yeah.
so we need to see what is it about the administrative rules and practices that are desirable. And then so we can continue this conversation. And there's enough here that I think we can move further.
No, I agree that ADC should post their rules and procedures online so everybody can see. I agree with that,
Okay.
right? So you're correct on that. I completely think you're right. So,
And I think that they should reference them in their decision making. You know, they should defend their decisions on the basis of their policies. Like the folks who are watching from the public should be able to see the alignment between their structure and their actions. And I don't think that's happening.
Then I think there's some language here that we can work with, and so we'll further massage that area. Members, so we touched on like those three. Is there anything else on this area of policies, procedures, authorizing statute, mission, planning statements? We'll fold those all in together. There is a section, members, on the financial auditing section. I believe it begins on around page 36. Now that we have more information coming about the delayed work between KMH and Acuity, we'll fill that in based upon the written documentation that we have. And then continue that the audit be performed on ADC's Kauai, that an independent audit be performed on ADC's Kauai land and water infrastructure portfolio. Is that section sufficient, members? Because so this is how we're dealing with the recommendation, members, is that the committee recommends that an audit be performed on ADC's Kauai land and water infrastructure portfolio that was omitted by the auditor in this instance. Any discussion about that?
Yeah, can I just point to, I don't know if members received, but there's a recent article that outlined, and also some newspaper coverage, media coverage of KAA's efforts to seek IAL designation before the Land Use Commission, which raised several concerns by members of the commission, and so that decision was deferred. But they were approaching the Land Use Commission in a way that I thought was problematic because ADC is the landowner, right? So I think that there's a usurpation of authority and we're seeing it in multiple directions. And that's another reason that I would really like to see this audit completed on the ADC lands on Kauai. Because I feel that not only is the majority of the ADC land on Kauai undeveloped, but it was never explored in the original audit, which raised questions for us. And then we have these additional dynamics. And if we are interested in adopting or recommending the use of this co-op structure, I think we need to understand more about it.
Okay, can you share that article? Because I believe you shared that with me, but if you can share that link again, and then I will make sure that all members of the committee get it. That is a new development. I will say, members, again, from the information that was around the Kauai lands at the time that this audit began, there were significant issues that were ignored and omitted in designating the scope. And then since then, right, we have learned about, all of the Clean Water Act agreements that have come up with, with the cooperation of all the stakeholders on Kauai to some degree. We have learned about now Monsanto's statewide use of pesticides that has implications that leads to the questions about remediation and whether or not the leases have the appropriate remediation language that we are recommending that they have. And now this final further development, which is this IAL designation, which members in the documents received by this committee, there is notations that had been a project of ADC to be able to get legislation for KAA to get IAL designation, and that legislation has repeatedly failed. So in some ways, the legislature has spoken and already said, because the ADC, as Vice Chair Perruso has pointed out, it is the owner. We are the owners. So if anyone should get the tax credit, it should be us, but that means we should get the taxes, right? Anyway, so with that said, I will add that, Representative Perruso. Is there anything outstanding left out? There was some sections, members. Oh, there are two sections I want to go back to. Both some recommendations around oversight of employment of the staff as well as the executive director, and then board membership. Members, on the issue of, kind of the employer-employee relationship between the board, ADC board, and their staff, my sense from the testimony is that the performance audit is ongoing, and we need to continue to support those efforts, but they are engaging in that. They are engaged in that in a meaningful way. So I don't think we have to, if there's a section in here about that, I want to just say that we continue to support that process. But this question of board membership has come up, and I don't know that we had much time. I could not for the life of me see where in the testimony we actually asked specific board members about the status of board membership. So I just wanted to open up this question to the committee. I think I personally appreciate the fact that the board for ADC has board members that are on the Board of Agriculture, the Office of Planning, the Commission of Water Resources. So those are all kind of required. But is there a sense that there's something missing that we need to highlight? We had Fred Lau come before this committee as the new chairman of the ADC board. And I found him to be very credible and very knowledgeable about farming practice in general and very strategic. So if there are certain qualities that we want in board membership, we can either discuss that here or if there can be further conversation to me. Otherwise, I'm a little bit at a loss for that section. Chair Hashem or Representative Vice Chair Perruso. Go ahead.
I do have thoughts on that, primarily because I've watched so many of the meetings, and I noted that 3 of the current members come from the construction industry or field sector and housing development sector. And then a 4th comes from transportation, so representative from Young Brothers. And while all of them are fine people, I have noticed that the matters that come before the board are about agricultural business, like agricultural questions, like expanding concerns, amending leases, different types of irrigation systems. And I submit that it would be more beneficial to the work of the board to have people who are actually engaged in agriculture on that board. I understand that it's agribusiness, and that is, but I also think that most farmers who are operating in the commercial sphere over a certain limit are involved by definition in agribusiness already. And I have noticed that with the exception of Mr. Hong, that the other folks who don't have an agricultural background do not have much to offer to the conversation. That is, they don't have much to contribute to the answers to these questions. And it's simply because they don't have the agricultural background, and these are, they're mostly farming questions. So I also think that it would be useful to have, there are lots of, folks in our university community, and there are lots of folks engaging in different kinds of farming practices. It would probably be worthwhile to have a diversity. We have a couple of cattle ranchers on the board. It might be good to have, and I appreciate Mr. Val's background. It might be good to have someone who is engaged in organic farming, and there are definitions, there are standards you can identify, like someone who is doing that. It might be good to have someone who is engaged in traditional Hawaiian agricultural practices, just so that, I really believe that when you have a range of voices at the table, then you're gonna have better outcomes. And I feel like we're just not getting that critical mass at the ADC board. And which is not to say anything negative about any of the board members. Like they're, really concerned community members, and they're donating their time, and I appreciate their service. But if we are looking for more energy from that board, then people who are passionate about and have committed their lives to agriculture, I think are the natural kinds of appointees.
Can I say something? Because a light bulb just came on actually for me. And then I'm going to throw it to Chair Hashem for further discussion. When you said the Young Brothers representative on ADC board, it just triggered for me the authorizing statute, which has ADC should be like concerned about transportation networks, statewide and internationally. So actually, the current board membership reflects the authorizing language of a decade ago.
Correct.
And those things that you are talking about, organic farmers, traditional Hawaiian agriculture, I would add regenerative agriculture, those are all actually part of this new wave and this new place and stage in which agriculture is now in. So what I would suggest, because there has been discussion about, again, rephrasing and adding more local food production as one of the focuses, in addition to the export, that could then help further focus, that we then add a board member that reflects that competency of local agricultural production, food production, that touches upon some of these other areas. Is that something that we could work on? I think that captures what you're concerned about for board
That totally
membership.
makes sense to me, because I think transportation is so critical for agriculture, but it should be that conversation is at the Board of Ag level, I think, because I don't think ADC can be managing, transportation. That's not within their kuleana. They can't, I don't think they can do that.
Well, it's in their kuleana now because the statute is
right.
outdated and not modernized. So that's the first thing we need to do.
Appropriate kuleana.
Okay. Is that a good compromise, members? Go ahead,
Yeah,
Representative.
so, I understand to get a diverse group of people, but sometimes you can bring in people for that kind of information. And I just caution the committee to, if we should have a floricultural person, we should have a landscaping person, we should, the list can go on and on. And all of them are agribusiness. So, you need to think that through.
Okay, let's work on this, but I think this is the good formulation of the good piece of it. Go ahead, Chair Hashem.
I agree with what Representative Yamashita is saying. There's agriculture is so vast. There's agriculture research that's you can have bees. Which is a part of agriculture. So I think ADC's mission should be just to promote agriculture. And with other statutes, you can deal with food production.
Okay.
Because over time, this will change. That mix will change. You don't want to come back and change the statute. You allow them to deal with that in their rules.
Okay, this is the start, I think, gives me some direction for what we can do.
They have Christmas tree farmers, they have all kinds of stuff.
The current board membership has the cattle farmer and Fred Lau's. So he's ornamental flowers and food production. Okay, we'll revisit this, but I think there's some direction here that we can work with. And maybe it is, as Rep. Yamashita says, that there'll be more subject matter.
If I can add one more comment.
Okay.
I think in general, it's just difficult for us to think all these things through because we haven't even discussed the role of USDA and all their different, how they play into this, right? And for us to study that would take forever. Because there's NRCS, there's FSA, there's rural development, there's like 4 sections, and it's all different. And they all can come into play on how it interacts with this agency as well as Department of Agriculture.
Any further discussion on the Agribusiness Development Corporation chapter members? I do have, I'm sorry, I apologize. I have one noted question for my, the unreported issues. As we go into the next section on the Office of the Auditor and some of the concerns raised, some of my sense is that there's frustration on maybe both sides of the ADC audit. Should we recommend that a performance audit be conducted potentially via an entirely independent auditor? And in this instance, there have been instances in the legislature where we asked that an independent auditor step in. I think it would be unusual to have an independent performance auditor step in, but we have had other audit firms in the past where we've commissioned audits or analysis done. The one that I can remember is in part for the autism insurance or health insurance. I think we had requested another CPA firm and we had actually appropriated monies for that. Is that something that we recommend just because there might be some concerns about the independence and objectivity of the auditor? We can be silent that the audit, who the audit to be performed by, but I'm just putting that out there. Because we can make a recommendation that an independent auditor step in to do this piece of it. I'll leave that as an open question, but members, if that's something that you guys would want to think about and talk with me about, Representative Hashem.
I think we should do one in 5 years to see where.
Oh, the
and all the
timing of
changes,
it.
right?
From the Kobayashi?
No, about everything. Because
Oh.
there's an audit, we're implementing changes, doing recommendations and see how they.
But I think the audit was incomplete.
Yeah, but this committee kind of did an audit in itself. So,
Not
and we're
really.
making recommendations, right? So it's sort of like our own internal audit of amateurs.
How about this?
Well, me, I'm an amateur, I'm not an auditor, I speak for myself.
Yeah, I don't feel like I completed an audit.
But
Okay, this raises the question, members, right? We know that under the current procedures, ADC has a follow-up audit with the current Office of the Auditor, and they are going through that. We also know that hopefully financial audits will come to us, so that'll be further evidence. And maybe that an independent performance audit be aligned with if we are going to request more robust policies and procedures and or rulemaking in some capacity, that we time an independent performance audit to occur after both the current auditors completes their work as well as any timing that we impose for updated policies and procedures.
I think
Okay.
that's a better way to go about it.
Okay, we'll map out a timeline for that.
Next year.
Well, and I think an important point to make is that we're flying an aircraft as we're improving it, and that things are happening. So a performance audit actually would be more critical after they've been able to implement some of their things that they're already doing in response to the audit and our investigative committee's work. Okay. Okay, members, moving to chapter 4, we're near the end. Members, this is a pretty complete section. We can, I think, take it up kind of bullet point by bullet point or the bold. I want to also share before I do this though. Well, you know what, let's let's take up the first recommendation, which is the manual of guides, because I think that's the least, it should be the least controversial one. This one here is to request that the auditor update the Office of Auditors Manual of Guides and require regular training to maintain best practices consistent with government auditing standards. Just on its face, members, this is a recommendation that the policies and procedures of the office just be updated to the most recent and current government auditing standards. Any discussion about this? And then the training consistent with the government auditing standards. Go ahead, Representative Kobayashi.
So just regarding chapter 4 in general, much of what I've seen in the report, I found really shocking. Particularly in the first 3 chapters, there's much innuendo really which seemed designed to just cast a negative light on the Office of the Auditor. But this chapter 4 was particularly egregious, I believe. As I've stated before, this committee was formed to investigate compliance with the audits of ADC and SODR, not to attack the auditor. Much of what's said pertaining to the auditor is way over the line and could even be construed as defamatory. Those portions of the draft report do not reflect my position for the record. As an auditor myself, I know that much of what is said in this report is incorrect and improper.
Okay, thank you for your comments. Representative Kobayashi, I think we have heard sufficient testimony over time. Your opinion is as one member of the committee. Any further just general comments before we go into each of these recommendations? Oh, okay, seeing none, we'll continue. So back to the comment about updating policies and procedures in accordance with most current government auditing standards. Any discussion here? Okay, so I'm taking that as this is okay. I mean, this is updating policies and procedures in accordance to what all offices, auditing offices should be doing. And Mr. Kondo himself attests that his agency is doing, even though the manual of guides that we were provided, I believe, was only up until 2014. So we're just asking them to become current. Okay, next members, the draft audit requirements. Okay, this section, members, was about the whole production of recommendations and the questions about whether the agencies were given enough time. There was also a set of questions about timeliness and completion of the audits, kind of issues related to practices. Any comments here, members?
Sure.
Go ahead.
Only that it just makes logical sense to me that the auditor does provide not only the findings, but also the recommendations for the auditee to review. I mean, that I think makes sense to me logically, that the recommendations are included in the draft report.
Okay, thank you. And that we also know, members, that that's consistent with the kind of the standards laid out, that recommendations be included. So that would actually make it consistent with the Yellow Book standard. And we'll also make sure that this is correct. And then it also reflects what we had heard in the testimony from some of the representatives of the various agencies, that it was surprising to them because they had been involved in other audits before where recommendations were in fact provided. And so this was kind of like a deviation from practice and from good practice. Any discussions on that, members? Thank you. Okay, members, the section on the timeliness of the completion of the audits. I have a lot of concerns now that we have heard about some of the delays that have been caused, and it appears, in fact, and it corroborates that ABC believed that they had been done with all the work that they needed to do to complete the financial audit in January of 2021. That might have been a little bit of an understatement, but they have also said that they were, and so that they thought that they were done. And so that this request that we see and get a copy of Acuity's financial audit be done immediately is grounded in that kind of that testimony that we received from both ADC and now KMH saying that they were essentially done. And in addition, KMH saying that there is a practice where unqualified reports could be provided, that we have that immediately and direct the auditor immediately to release that, because at a certain point in time, 2019 is going to be irrelevant to 2022. Any discussion on that? Any discussion on that request? Okay, seeing none. Okay, members, there's a whole section on the transparency of the Office of the Auditor, access to working papers, recorded interviews, witness reluctance and hesitancy, misleading or false statements. I'd like to comment on is there any comments on any of this other than Representative Kobayashi's general comments? So I do just want to point out that the recommendation on the working papers is to clarify the confidentiality clause, that working papers be made available to investigative committees. We're going to make some amendments to make this more consistent with practice that we have seen across other jurisdictions, where working papers are routinely made available to investigative committees, such as ourselves. That's a reasonable request. We're going to push for that. That was something that had been set forth as ways to block this committee. Okay. Similarly, members, any comments or suggestions or thoughts on clarifying that transparency of documents should be allowed, particularly when other safeguards are met? And in fact, that whole situation we had where we had signed waivers of people who had recorded interviews and they themselves had requested the interviews and could not get a copy because of this confidentiality statement, that we addressed that issue. Chair Hashem, did you have anything with respect to those recorded interviews and the use of those recorded interviews? Okay. Okay, and members, you guys can also, you may also contact me again for any thoughts and ideas and additions to this area. On the witness reluctancy, members, so today we heard and learned, and we only recently learned as a committee as of Friday, that there may have been improper conduct of the Office of the Auditor with respect to witness testimony. This, I propose, is going to be and should be fleshed out in the witness reluctance and hesitancy section. There is the recommendation here is that we need to clarify that cooperation with an investigative committee is not somehow an ethics violation that jeopardizes a potential witness. I think what we saw today raises some serious concerns and raises for me objectivity questions about the Office of the Auditor that have in fact been raised. So to that end, members, any comments or thoughts? Go ahead, Representative Kobayashi.
Thank you, Representative. So, so far I've heard from the chair of this committee and from Chair Tarnas regarding the validity or not of statements and accusations made in this meeting and in the draft report. For my other committee members, if I could request an answer for the record on whether the statements and accusations being made against the Office of the Auditor reflects your individual positions. And I think the public we serve deserves an answer to that simple question from each committee member. Whether the statements and accusations made against the Office of the Auditor reflects your individual positions.
So Mr. Kobayashi, I will let that question be answered and posed to the committees to the extent that they want to answer.
Sure.
So there appear to be some that want to answer, but I will also say a no, that the actions taken by this committee through our voting procedures is a reflection of our individual decisions about the content of this committee report. And I will also share that this has been an ongoing process since May, when this committee was created. And so this committee has been engaged in the conversations and questions and gathering the testimony, involved in numerous informal meetings, as well as conversations concerning this matter. So from my point of view, at the end of the day, when this committee acts, that is the voice with which this committee will speak with, and that reflects the due diligence and hard work of all of the committee members, all of the committee members. And we may not have a unanimous vote, but it will be a reflection of both this committee's work as well as the individual members of this committee. So on that note, Representative Perruso, I noticed that you might want to answer.
I want to respond to that. So I will say that at the outset of this committee's work, I did not have questions with respect to the auditor, and that as a result of our hearings and reading documents and talking to witnesses, certain questions have surfaced. And I think that those questions deserve attention. And I think that it's our job. I think that I was present at the same Council of Western Governments or State Governments, I forget the name, but and in that particular session on investigatory or oversight committees. And I think that it is true that it is our duty to follow these questions and to evaluate them and to maybe open a pathway for an additional conversation. I don't think it's off limits to talk about the auditor. And my original concern, frankly, was the failure to address the Kauai lands. And it's, they pose the most risk. They're the vast majority of the lands in the ADC portfolio. And for me, my understanding of the history of ADC was rooted in the Kauai lands. So why those would be omitted or not addressed was my initial concern, his willingness to be a strong auditor. And he uses strong language. And I frankly appreciate that. But I also think that it's also legitimate to ask questions about process and approach, and to see to try to figure out what we're not seeing. So I do support the findings.
Did you have a hand in drafting any of this stuff about the auditor?
Not about the auditor, but I think that we are all asked to contribute like our insights or our findings, and I did so with respect to ADC.
So, I mean, there's just a lack of discussion when it comes to chapter 4. So you're basically okay with everything in there?
I mean, I understand your concerns as well. I understand where you're coming from, that you think that this is overreaching and making arguments that are not substantiated. I hear that. And I think that it's asking questions that we could still talk about. I think it's fair to talk about these questions.
So I guess it's a yes, as far as.
Yeah, I mean, which is not to say that this is a document that I wrote, but I support the intent.
Thanks for your answer, appreciate it.
Okay, members, any further discussion on this reluctance and hesitancy? Let's see. Okay. I think we can move, well, again, to connect this with what we learned today, members, I am very concerned because this committee has attempted at various times to bring other witnesses forward on some of these issues. And we have found that certain witnesses would not come forward because of the kind of behavior that we saw demonstrated by the auditor. Things like threatening ethics violations. I feel, and we have looked at, and the staff have looked at, even in this effort to influence the testimony following the testimony provided under oath by Mr. Ross Murakami, that there have been certain potential problems of misconduct. And I think what I would share is that, HRS 710, Part 6, related to offenses related to judicial and other proceedings, there are instances of witness intimidation, tampering of witnesses, and retaliation against witnesses that are potential problems with the conduct displayed by Mr. Kondo. It's not for us to determine that, but certain questions have been raised. And so with the indulgence of the committee on this portion on witness reluctance and hesitancy, and possibly also on the area of a further performance audit or investigation into the Office of the Auditor, that some of these concerns now be placed into the report because of the serious questions that have been raised. And members, if you take a look at that chapter, yes, while chapter 21 is our guiding statute, like any other body, corporate body, person, multiple laws relate to the way in which we operate. And chapter 710 is offenses against public administration. Legislatures and legislative committees are identified in this chapter as these laws being applicable. I had mentioned earlier in a public meeting of this committee that conduct would be frowned upon and looked negatively upon if it was determined to be witness tampering, witness intimidation, or obstruction of justice. These are where all those offenses reside in HRS 710. So we will be working on some information and findings with respect to what we have just learned today and what we will see, I think, in the subpoena documents that we will receive. Any comments or questions on this? Go ahead.
So your proposal is really under the premise that, just so this is all clear, that subsequent to the testimony of Ross Murakami, the accusation is that the auditor had a discussion with a business partner of Ross Murakami about the some of the dates regarding, or some of the statements made regarding the completion of the audit, and possibly other things that have not been ascertained. There's been no effort to subpoena that partner, Mr. Choi, to come in here and answer the questions directly. Now, if we do have concerns, and you brought up the word in particular, witness tampering, which is quite a serious charge to make, would it be not in our interest, again, I've raised this in other issues, to get an opinion of the State Attorney General legally as to your accusation that witness tampering occurred with the subsequent testimony discussion, not with the witness, but with a business partner of his about the audit completion dates in particular?
I will take you a step further, Representative Kobayashi. I think my recommendation to this committee will be to recommend that we refer this to the AG's office for investigation and for further investigation, because we are not equipped as this legislative investigative committee to look into the questions of potential civil and criminal misconduct. So yes, I do agree that it should be turned over to the Attorney General's office.
But that is your assertion, is that there was criminal witness tampering occurring here potentially?
No, my concern is that it might be, but we don't know. And so just like in the auditing world that you are part of, Mr. Kobayashi, right? There is a way for investigative committees to note a concern, pass it on, not do further investigation so as to harm the state of the record. Hence, that's why I also asked Mr. Murakami's firm to make sure that they don't destroy any potential evidence that this now be turned out of our hands and this committee make a referral to the AG's office for further investigation where they have far greater tools and time in which to further investigate this issue. I will also say, Mr. Kobayashi, if you read the section on BKD and the rail audits, there is some disconcerting information there about the conduct and the independence and objectivity of the Office of the Auditor. And it pains me to say this because I too entered into this process focused on the audits of SLDF and EDC, but I would also like to share with you a communication that has been received, and this will be made part of the public record as well as added to the report. This was a communication received by a member of this committee, not myself, a member of this committee that raises some of the same issues that we are raising and the concerns and questions that are being raised in our audit recommendations. So I'm passing out this email, and this again will be made part of the record. I will say that this is also part of the record because really any communications to us as public officials are subject to also transparency and disclosure. So I'm just going to share this, and then whether we commented or not, or you comment on to me later on, I'm passing around this email that had been communicated to a member of this committee. And I will say that as you can see, the question to me as chair had been, how should we handle this? This was not something that I was willing to go down because one of the timing on November 12th. But in addition, as we have seen in one of the recommendations, I think this needs to be taken up by an independent investigator because these are serious accusations. Now that we have evidence from Randall Lee as one of the heart auditors whose contract was canceled under a cloud that has not been fully explained. We have information about BKD's relationships with contracts, not just with the rail audit, but also with additional audits. And now we have a communication where Mr. Kondo reached out to the partner who is in charge for the financial audits of the Department of, of KMH, not the business solutions section that Mr. Murakami was, but part of the financial audit section, which has important contracts that are subject to the auditor's control. Okay. So yes, it's on all of those, for all of those reasons. Yes.
So, you know, when we look at the pattern of things, I mean, what I'm talking about here, I think is concerns expressed to me by, so I have one email here with concerns about the audit. I've gotten so many concerns by the public about really the validity of what we're doing here. So maybe it's not in terms of an email, but I mean, there's been a lot of concerns raised about this. And I think when you look at the pattern of behavior, it's really quite concerning that last session, we had a committee put together to investigate the auditor, which came up with a long report. Really nothing came of it. It seemed difficult to really find anything of substance in there. As chair of the Legislative Management Committee, during this past session, I was submitted bills under my purview to cut the compensation of the auditor, to combine the Office of the Auditor with other state agencies. And those were both measures that I refused to hear as chair of the first committee being referred to. And now we have this. So forgive me if, you know, it seems like a pattern to me rather than just something that just popped out in the middle of this investigation.
I'm not sure what you're saying, Representative Kobayashi, but if you're saying that, you know, as chair of the Legislative Management Committee, you had authority to not hear those bills, that's completely fine. The work of this investigative committee was grounded in subpoenas and testimony provided. We followed the evidence, and this is where it's led us to. I don't dispute that you've recited the things that have happened, but this was an independent process. Did we draw upon some of the work of that investigative committee? we asked some of the questions, but I think you will also see that we diverted from the work of that investigative committee or that committee that you're speaking of. So I'm not sure what you're trying to say.
So, okay, I'll clarify for you that many in the public seem to feel that this is a continuation of a pattern of targeting the office of the auditor. So just to put it plainly.
Okay, thank you
If
for.
that's hard to understand, I'll clarify further.
Okay, no,
but
thank you
I
for
believe
that.
that's what the public is concerned about, and that's why I raise these issues, because constituents have been raising it to me.
Thank you, and I agree. I think that there's a lot that it's been written about this committee. I have received other testimony that has raised some concerns. I have not received any testimony criticizing, although I have read the public statements. I've read numerous letters by Auditor Kondo protesting this process. We even went to court where he protested our accessibility of known public records. So I think that there's a difference of opinion, and I think that represents our democracy. So I respect that there are other people in the public who think that otherwise, but I think there are people, and I would submit to you, Representative Kobayashi, that there are other people who think we are heading down the right path.
And that's the basis for what we're saying here is the one email you have this, although there has been, like I say, two sides to this. That's my point.
This is the one email that was received by one member of the committee. I don't know what other emails. However, the specificity of this email is striking. And so hence, that is why I submitted it to you folks. I have also received early on one or two emails also, but it did not appear to have the name of a person, whereas this one does. I've also blanked out that person's name because at this time, I'm not sure if there could be any witness intimidation, harassment, or retaliation for future, whoever this person is. And I personally don't know who this person is. But at this point in time, that's why it's going to be redacted. So, all right, members, any other further discussion on this? Okay, we're gonna keep going with the Chapter 4, Office of the Auditor. I really wanted to highlight this because it's going to circle back to the conversation that Representative Perruso, Vice Chair Perruso had about concerns about public trust doctrine, public land trust, ceded revenues, and SLDF. It was also part of the conversation we had with Chair Tarnas. I think I have enough guidance from this committee, but did anyone want to add anything further here? Because under this subsection where we talk about and discuss the public land trust doctrine, it's under the section of misleading or false statements. Did anyone want to add anything for this, or is everyone comfortable with kind of the conversation we had? And that I will take that information and feedback from this committee and put this into this section so that it might mirror the other part.
I just wanted to reiterate my position that that Deputy AG's memo be made public, as to the extent possible, and that reasoning be subject to public scrutiny, and that it be the basis for additional inquiry and public conversation.
I appreciate that. And I think one of the things is that maybe one of the recommendations is that there would be a special investigative committee on the ceded land versus us disclosing what is clearly attorney-client privileged documents. That would be the one area, but I think we can go back and forth on that and we can come up with a recommendation, because this discussion of ceded lands and public trust doctrine was very convoluted across the two audits.
I would support that recommendation.
Okay, thank you. Any other further discussion? Okay, members, there is a section on further follow-up needed for the Office of the Auditor, and there are two main recommendations under this. First set of recommendations regards the findings that we had and recommendations that we had, specifically around the rail contract and BKD. There's kind of an option put before this committee. If you all look to page 50, excuse me. It's under the section of further follow-up needed. If you look at page 46, the first recommendation is that we recommend that the legislature require the auditor to submit a report on the expenditure of public funds related to all of the audit work conducted pursuant to Act 1's Special Session Laws 2017, including any litigation costs involving its disputes with any contractors hired by the Office of the Auditor pursuant to Act 1. And or the committee recommends that the legislature require the Office of the Auditor to submit a report on the outcomes and costs involving its dispute with BKD, including litigation costs and the agencies who are ultimately responsible for paying for those costs when the matter is resolved. Members, the first recommendation is more specific to the rail audit. The second one begins to encapsulate the concerns that BKD's, the relationship with BKD is currently under potential dispute, and that there have been issues with other contracts that the Office of the Auditor has with BKD, and that we just simply want, when everything is resolved, a report on those outcomes and costs involving the Office of the Auditor's dispute with BKD, as we would be entitled to with, claims against the states. We get a report, or we have to pass a bill annually that appropriates money for litigation costs and settlements over a certain amount. This would be a kind of a report on what those litigation costs are and any settlement costs. And then what's different is that because some of these audits and contractual relationships deal with pass-throughs, it's actually the agencies that may be having to foot the cost of these bills and not the auditor. So that's why we need the report of the agencies who may have been ultimately or will be ultimately responsible for any payment of those costs. Any questions, members? I know that's a lot, but this is all information that has come in through that last subpoena ducis tecum we had, as well as because we could not get the cooperation of BKD to speak publicly, we relied all upon the public record.
Can I just ask a question? So you give us a choice of language, it seems. And it also seems to me that the report requested in the initial language, or the language at the top, could be produced sooner than the second option.
Oh, okay.
I would prefer that top language, both because it's broader, but then we're not waiting for the whole matter to be resolved. I would like to see the costs associated with that audit work.
Okay, so we can put a timeline on that. And then are you okay with adopting both then recommendations?
Yeah.
I see an affirmative from Chair Tarnas. And
Just so you, I'm okay actually having both of the recommendations.
we will massage the language on the timing. And I saw a head nod from Representative Ichiyama. Yes, okay. Okay, members, this leads us to the last recommendation, further investigation into a performance audit of the Office of the Auditor. I did want to share one other communication, and it's interesting because, we have been talking about scope. We've been talking about objectivity. At the very outset of the beginnings of these public hearings, I was asked, we had documentation that identified my law office in some of the testimony. There had actually been two other entities that had been redacted from this piece of testimony that had been provided by DLNR. The unredacted testimony was provided to us. And in this recommendation where we're asking for an independent committee along the lines of, excuse me, not this one. Oh, I have to go back, members. It's actually the recommendation of, our recommendation related to an independent committee. Oh, it's the very last recommendation about establishing greater collaboration with and oversight of the Office of the Auditor. So I share this unredacted email because what it shows is that there may be more conflict of interest, in fact, with with house concerns not being maybe addressed by the auditors. So members, I'm passing out this document, DLNR-LD-012258 unredacted, that shows and raised conflict of interest matters that were concerned for DLNR with respect to the audits themselves, but I think sheds light onto maybe the need that for scope purposes, this kind of independent committee be established. And members, in this email, what we see is communications that as Mr. Chun was disengaging from employment with DLNR, there was those multiple consultations with an attorney with the law office of the law office that I had disclosed I had been a member of, but also that there was an unsolicited job offer from the state auditor. There was a Gulf foursome that would include Senator Donovan Della Cruz, and multiple conversations with Senator Ron Kochi's office. So I think the recommendation, and I share this members with you because of the concerns about objectivity. We heard some testimony throughout about the objectivity of scope of initial audits. We've seen the absence of Kauai being seriously looked at. We saw a blind eye being turned to a Kauai forged easement, and then we saw the disregard of Kauai lands in the SLDF audit. And so this committee, members, is in one way to establish better collaboration, coordination, oversight of the Office of the Auditor. And it mirrors some good practice in other government sectors where there is an audit committee that helps to oversee the work management and workflow of the Office of the Auditor. So that's what's driving that recommendation in part, in addition to all the concerns that have been raised throughout this investigative committee's work. Any discussion, conversation?
Yes, I'm confused.
Yes.
Help me understand this, because I'm not sure how this goes to, so this goes to your analysis of the auditor in that the auditor is also named in this email.
It goes to the lack of objectivity. And there's a lot that's going on with this because it has to be placed into context of the fact that Mr. Keith Chun, as we learned, and it was alluded to in the testimony by DLNR and the Land Division, there was a part of the testimony where there was concerns with the conflict of interest and independent objectivity of individual audit team members, because there was an individual who had been part of this movement from DLNR's staff to the auditor's office, whereas Mr. Chun had received an unsolicited job offer from the state auditor. I believe 2 or 3 of his other team members had also been offered positions, and they actually moved over. And then that was the question where DLNR, rightfully so, and correctly so, raised the question of objectivity of the audit, because some of those members who had moved over, in addition to Mr. Chun, who had decided not to move over to the auditor's office, raised many of the same concerns that were then we saw both repeated in Mr. Chun's testimony, repeated in the audit. And so there's this sense of lack of objectivity, but this sheds light that there might be more structural lack of objectivity.
Regarding the accusation of Keith Chun being offered a job by the auditor, that was addressed during his testimony, and it was made clear that that never happened.
Yes, and this confirms it, an unsolicited job offer. He confirms that there was a job offer.
That there was not. He confirmed that there was not.
Well, if he did.
Teacher did not agree that he was offered a job.
He says he was offered a job.
He said he was offered a
this
job in
email.
this one. So we'll go back and look at that testimony. But now, Kobayashi, you're saying is that Mr. Chan lied.
He wanted to, no, that he said that he needed to work a few days a week, and under that basis, so it is semantics, but I mean, really, I mean, when Keith Chun was here, it's pretty clear that it's not something that he would have ever entertained to, unless he could work a few days a week.
I think you're correct, Representative Kobayashi. Mr. Chun confirmed that he did not take up the offer. He confirmed there was a job offer. And this letter and email from Mr. Chun also confirms that he had an unsolicited job offer. So
there was a discussion of whether he would be interested to work
yeah,
there.
so I don't think we're disagreeing.
Not an offer letter with terms and things there.
Well, so there was a discussion and unsolicited, it confirms. So yes.
Okay.
Right. Members, aside from this, any conversation about this recommendation that there be this committee? And you know, my view is that, again, we're always looking to best practices, improving government. You know, some of us won't be here. Well, I know all of us won't be here forever. So what we're trying to establish is a process and a procedure, government practice that can ensure greater confidence and oversight of the Office of the Auditor. And so I took language from other known oversight tools that are actually used within our own jurisdiction. Both the City and County of Honolulu and Kauai has this language in their charter. So that's what I mirrored that from. Finally, members, if there's, go ahead.
So just a clarification question. Is the proposal that this committee be a body of the House or in the House or in both the House and Senate, or?
It would be both House and Senate. I think establishment of an audit committee, just as the, and maybe I can be more explicit, we recommend legislation that establishes an audit committee similar to that, which is in the City and County of Honolulu and Kauai. I don't think so it would be something that we'd have to enact legislation for.
Okay.
We could do it, I guess if your question is, could we do it by rules? Anything is possible with our rules. But this would be obviously something that we do jointly with House and Senate, because the auditor is actually at the end of the day working for the House and the Senate.
Mm-hmm.
And so we need the concerns of the House also to be articulated, especially if there's this outweighing of balances. Okay. Go ahead.
So, if anything has been made clear regarding this recommendation and what's occurred in this committee, one thing, if any audit committee is set up, the key is that it's independent from this body, that the independence of the Office of the Auditor, I think has never been more important than after what we've gone through here, that independence is key. And yeah, you can have an audit committee set up, but make sure it's not one that controls the behavior of the auditor for the benefit of the body. That would be my concern.
And I think we can look at the language that's in the charter of the City and County of Honolulu, as well as the charter of the County of Kauai, to make sure that, because I don't think that they're going to say that they're beholden to the councils. I believe that they would say that there is independence still preserved. In addition, they are subject to government auditing standards. So there are standards for independence, objectivity, professional judgment, and all of that, which we refer to. But yeah, I agree.
So actually, yeah, not just in a legalese sense, but just in real world sense, right? I mean, a lot of times you can hide behind legal things and say, oh, well, technically this is okay. But really, the average guy in the street is going to go, obviously not. So just in both legal and substantive terms, we need to make sure that the auditor is always able to act independently. And that's so key to the functioning of our government.
I agree with that. I think independently and objectively as well. In accordance essentially with the Yellow Book standards that is supposed to govern any Office of Auditors.
Just independent,
Yep.
That's it.
Yeah, the yellow book standards, I would say. One other thing, and thank you for bringing this back to my attention. I skipped over one recommendation. Now, this is specific to this Office of the Auditor and not to just kind of the structural creation of a committee that will have hopefully long-lasting effect beyond any of our offices or before this current auditor. There is a specific recommendation for further investigation into or a performance audit of the Office of the Auditor recommendation. Members, I think here is where I might also embed, because of the more recent communications and testimony we have received, that further investigation be looked into for some of these matters that have just recently come to this committee's attention, and that we make that referral to the State Attorney General's office. So I'll put that in here, but the performance audit would not be something that the AG's office would engage in. The recommendation here, members, is because there have been so many issues raised, the meat of this recommendation is that there be a performance audit of the Office of the Auditor conducted. We have learned that there have been reviews in the past, most recently an NCSL audit, but it seems to have looked at the same issues that we looked at, but have reached a different conclusion. So there's a couple of things that we could do. It could be that the performance audit or investigation be something of a future investigative committee that is now very specifically looking in to the questions and concerns that were raised, that we either do by resolution, concurrent or single house resolution, the authorization of an additional Chapter 21 committee, or that an independent third party be retained to conduct a thorough performance audit. And that can be, members, I have staff looking into what are the various kinds of agencies. NCSL is one agency that does some periodic peer reviews, not but performance audit. We could ask if there is a national agency that kind of looks into these things, if it's a university body or think tank that really has the expertise to do a performance audit of a government agency audit, that we find that. So there's two ways to do it, right? We can either recommend a future investigative committee, or we can ask that a more thorough performance audit be conducted by an independent third party. And then we can find out what those organizations might be. I'm gonna throw that out to this committee because that was something that I didn't know what would be the pleasure of this committee.
My recommendation, if we tried twice and were unsuccessful in really finding anything substantive, it's kind of Twain's definition of insanity to try again, third committee to try to find dirt on the auditor. At some point, you just give it up.
Okay, so your recommendation is not to have another
I think it's just the third time trying the same thing.
Okay, well, what about Mr. Kobayashi? You said earlier that an independent party be to do this. So would you suggest that an independent third party in the form of your national auditing agency or a university think tank that focuses in on government oversight? Could we do that?
Well, what was the point of the first audit investigative committee? I believe the idea was to make it independent. So if you look at the membership, it was Edwin Young, Wes Machida, Senator Hanabusa, really, and that was set up. Nobody from this body. I mean, it's supposed to be an independent committee. So I would hold that that idea of trying to find an independent committee has already been done.
So, Mr. Kobayashi, using that logic, you had also, we have heard that Mr. Kondo didn't think that committee was independent. So I want an independent third party assessment of the performance of the Office of the Auditor. Any comment on that?
Okay, Mrs. Belatti, but independence is a matter of, as you say, perception, right? So whether he perceived it to be independent or not, I think that's what it was designed to do.
So did you think that do you think that the committee's report by the House committee was independent and that we can rely upon it then?
I don't have a comment on that. I say it was designed to be independent. It was designed to be independent, but I'm not gonna smear any of the members of that committee by saying that they were not, if that's what you're trying to get out of me. But I think that idea in going into that was that these were independent people, or you would have had people like us. So I think the differentiation is that that was supposed to be independent because we have members of the body here doing it. This is not. So let's go back to independent again with a third party.
All right, thank you. All right, so the question of the further investigation into performance audit, again, members, the question is a further investigative committee of an independent third party. Mr. Kobayashi, you actually don't want to see any further investigations. Members, any further comment on this recommendation? And if we should look to other further third parties, independent third parties to conduct a performance audit, if it's going to be the pleasure of this committee. Go ahead.
Yeah, I would say that for everybody, it probably would be helpful to have an independent third party do that so that we could all have a sense of confidence in whatever they conclude. And it wouldn't be subject to criticism that it's in any way, swayed by one house or the Senate or something.
Yes. Okay. Any further comment on this discussion point? All right, members, that would be the conclusion of kind of our discussion. Again, you can always send me insights, observations, call me, we can also talk. The goal is going to be that we will take up a final report on Tuesday, the 18th. Let's say 10 a.m. instead of 9:30 a.m. Is that okay? And I think we should be able to finalize then for our next meeting. I believe we've taken up everything on our agenda. Members, have we missed anything? Have I forgotten anything that I shared? All right. I had thought we would be able to complete this by noon, but it is 1 o'clock now. So I will let you all go to lunch if there's no further discussion. And there being no further discussion, we'll see you next week, Tuesday. Aloha, we are adjourned. Thanks. Did she say time?